Long before the mighty Tyrannosaurus rex shook the earth with its thunderous footsteps, long before the colossal sauropods grazed on ancient ferns, and long before the skies were ruled by pterosaurs, there existed a world so alien, so bizarre, that it would seem like pure fantasy to our modern eyes. This was the world of Pangea, the ultimate supercontinent, a massive landmass that brought together nearly all of Earth's terrain into one continuous expanse of land surrounded by a single vast ocean called Panthalassa. Welcome to a journey back in time, to an era that predates the age of dinosaurs by tens of millions of years. We're traveling to the Permian Period, a span of geological time that stretched from approximately 299 million years ago to 252 million years ago. This was a world where the rules of survival were written by creatures whose very names are unfamiliar to most people today, yet whose evolutionary innovations would shape the course of all life on Earth, including our own existence. The Permian world was not dominated by the reptilian dinosaurs that would later capture our imagination. Instead, it was ruled by an extraordinary group of animals called Synapsids, creatures that walked the evolutionary path toward mammals. These were the true pioneers of terrestrial life, the experimental prototypes that nature crafted as it explored the possibilities of life on land. Some grew massive sails on their backs that caught the light of an ancient sun. Others developed fearsome saber-like fangs that could pierce the toughest hide. Still others evolved beaks and bulk that allowed them to process vast quantities of prehistoric vegetation. But this was also a world of extremes, a planet pushed to its environmental limits. The very formation of Pangea created climatic conditions unlike anything seen in Earth's history before or since. Vast interior deserts stretched for thousands of miles, baked under relentless heat. Monsoon rains of staggering intensity flooded coastal regions seasonally, creating a rhythm of flood and drought that demanded constant adaptation. Temperature swings were radical, resources were scarce in many regions, and survival required innovation. And then, at the end of this remarkable period, came catastrophe. The Permian Period concluded with what scientists call the Permian-Triassic Extinction event, but what is more ominously known as the Great Dying. This was no ordinary extinction. It was the most severe biodiversity crisis in Earth's entire history, an apocalyptic event that erased approximately 90 to 96% of all marine species and 70% of terrestrial vertebrate species. The world that emerged from this catastrophe would be forever changed, setting the stage for the age of dinosaurs and, eventually, the age of mammals. The story of Pangea and the Permian Period is not just ancient history relegated to dusty museum halls and academic journals. It is a testament to the resilience of life, a demonstration of evolution's creative power, and a sobering reminder of how quickly a thriving world can be brought to its knees by environmental catastrophe. It is a story of dominance and extinction, of innovation and adaptation, of life's ability to persist even in the face of planetary catastrophe. As we embark on this journey through deep time, we will meet the bizarre and wonderful creatures that called Pangea home. We will walk through ancient forests of seed ferns and early conifers. We will witness predators locked in mortal combat with their prey. We will explore the geological forces that created this supercontinent and the volcanic fury that ultimately brought an entire era to its end. And through it all, we will trace the evolutionary thread that connects those ancient creatures to ourselves, for in the survivors of the Great Dying lie the origins of all mammals, including humanity. So prepare yourself for a voyage to a world that existed when our planet was young, when life on land was still a grand experiment, and when the ancestors of all modern mammals were just beginning to find their way in a harsh and unforgiving world. This is the story of Pangea, the world before dinosaurs. To understand the world of Permian Pangea, we must first grasp the sheer magnitude of what a supercontinent actually means. Imagine taking all of Earth's current continents and smashing them together into a single landmass. That was Pangea, a name that literally means all Earth in ancient Greek. This wasn't just a large continent, it was a complete rearrangement of the planet's surface, a geographic configuration that fundamentally altered how the Earth system functioned. The formation of Pangea was a process that took tens of millions of years, driven by the relentless movement of tectonic plates beneath the Earth's crust. These massive slabs of rock, floating on the semi-molten mantle below, had been drifting across the planet's surface for billions of years, occasionally colliding to form mountain ranges or rifting apart to create new ocean basins. But during the late Carboniferous period and into the Permian, these wandering continents began to converge in an unprecedented way. One by one, the ancient landmasses came together. Laurentia, which would eventually become North America, collided with Baltica, the core of what would become Europe. This collision pushed up the ancient Appalachian Mountains, which at the time of their formation rivaled the modern Himalayas in height. Siberia drifted southward and merged with the growing supercontinent. Gondwana, the massive southern landmass that included the future continents of South America, Africa, India, Australia, and Antarctica, joined the assembly, creating the final configuration of Pangea. By the early Permian period, approximately 300 million years ago, Pangea had essentially formed. It stretched from pole to pole, a vast C-shaped landmass that dominated the planet. To the east lay the Tethys Sea, a large body of water that penetrated deep into Pangea's eastern flank. To the west, north, and south stretched Panthalassa, the superocean, covering more than half of the entire planet's surface. There were no other significant landmasses. Earth had become, in essence, a world of one land and one sea. This geographic configuration had profound implications for climate, ocean circulation, and the evolution of life. With so much land concentrated in one area, the interior regions of Pangea were thousands of miles from any coastline. This created the most extreme continental climate ever experienced on Earth. To understand why, we need to consider how oceans moderate climate. In our modern world, the presence of multiple oceans distributed around the globe helps regulate temperature. Water has a high heat capacity, meaning it absorbs and releases heat slowly. This creates relatively stable temperatures in coastal regions. Ocean currents also redistribute heat from the equator toward the poles, preventing extreme temperature gradients. Moreover, oceans are the primary source of atmospheric moisture. Evaporation from the sea surface provides the water vapor that eventually falls as rain. But in Pangea, vast interior regions were cut off from these moderating influences. Thousands of miles from the nearest ocean, the continental interior became a realm of extremes. Temperatures soared during the day and plummeted at night. Seasonal variations were dramatic. Most critically, moisture-laden winds from the ocean lost their water content long before reaching the deep interior, creating immense desert regions that may have been largely lifeless. The fossil record and geological evidence paint a picture of Pangea's climate zones. At the equator, where Pangea's northern and southern halves nearly met, conditions were surprisingly arid. This seems counterintuitive, as equatorial regions today are typically wet and lush. But the configuration of Pangea disrupted normal atmospheric circulation patterns. The intense heating of the continental interior created powerful convective currents that altered wind patterns, resulting in persistent high-pressure systems over the equatorial regions of Pangea. These high-pressure zones suppressed rainfall, creating extensive equatorial deserts. Moving toward higher latitudes, we encountered the monsoon belts. These regions experienced perhaps the most dramatic seasonal climate variations ever seen on Earth. During summer months, the intense heating of Pangea's interior created massive low-pressure systems that drew moisture-laden air from Panthalassa inland. The result was torrential monsoon rains of staggering intensity, flooding vast areas and creating temporary wetlands and lakes. But during winter, the pattern reversed. High-pressure systems dominated, winds reversed direction, and these same regions became parched and dry. The seasonal extremes in these monsoon belts were unlike anything experienced in our modern world. Geological deposits from this time show evidence of intense seasonal flooding followed by complete drying out. Ancient river channels show evidence of catastrophic flood events. Sediments reveal cycles of wet and dry deposition. For the animals and plants living in these regions, adaptation to these extreme seasonal variations was not optional. It was a matter of survival. Further toward the poles, particularly in the southern portions of Gondwana, conditions were different. Here, glaciation had occurred during the late Carboniferous period, leaving behind vast ice sheets. As the Permian progressed and global temperatures gradually warmed, these ice sheets retreated, but the southern high latitudes remained cool and temperate. These regions supported different ecosystems adapted to cooler, more stable conditions. The atmospheric composition during the Permian was also notably different from today. Oxygen levels, which had peaked during the late Carboniferous period at perhaps 35% of the atmosphere compared to today's 21%, declined during the Permian. This decline in oxygen had significant implications for animal physiology, particularly for large animals that required substantial oxygen intake to fuel their metabolism. Carbon dioxide levels fluctuated throughout the Permian but were generally similar to or slightly higher than modern pre-industrial levels. However, toward the end of the Permian, as the volcanic activity that would ultimately trigger the Great Dying began, carbon dioxide levels would rise dramatically, contributing to rapid global warming and ocean acidification. The geological activity during the Permian was also significant. The collision of continents that created Pangea pushed up massive mountain ranges. The Appalachian Mountains in eastern Laurentia were formed by the collision with Gondwana. The Ural Mountains, which today divide Europe from Asia, were pushed up by the collision of Siberia with the rest of Pangea. These mountains weren't the weathered, rounded hills we see today. They were towering peaks, comparable to the modern Himalayas. These mountain ranges had important effects on climate and ecosystems. They created rain shadows, where moisture-laden winds dumped their water on the windward side of the mountains, leaving the leeward side dry. They created elevation gradients, with different climate zones at different altitudes. And they served as barriers to animal migration, potentially isolating populations and promoting evolutionary diversification. The interior of Pangea, particularly the vast equatorial deserts and the regions far from moderating ocean influences, presented enormous challenges to life. Water was scarce. Temperature fluctuations were extreme. Resources were limited. Yet life, as it always does, found ways to persist. Plants evolved adaptations to conserve water, including thick cuticles, reduced leaf surface area, and the ability to become dormant during dry periods. Animals evolved behavioral adaptations, such as burrowing to escape temperature extremes, and physiological adaptations to conserve water and regulate body temperature. The coastal regions and the monsoon belts, while still challenging, offered more opportunities for life. Here, seasonal abundance allowed ecosystems to flourish, at least temporarily. During the wet season, these regions would have been teeming with life, lush vegetation, abundant invertebrates, and the vertebrates that fed upon them. But during the dry season, these same regions would have been harsh and barren, forcing animals to migrate, estivate, or draw upon stored resources to survive. The river systems of Pangea were also crucial to understanding the distribution of life. Rivers flowing from the interior mountains toward the coasts created ribbons of habitability through otherwise inhospitable terrain. These river valleys would have served as corridors for animal migration and dispersal. Fossils of Permian animals are often found concentrated in ancient river deposits, suggesting that these waterways were focal points for prehistoric life. The ocean surrounding Pangea, Panthalassa, was also undergoing significant changes during the Permian. The formation of the supercontinent altered ocean circulation patterns. With most land concentrated in one area, oceanic currents were less complex than in our modern world of multiple ocean basins. The Tethys Sea, which penetrated deep into eastern Pangea, created its own circulation patterns and climate influences. Marine life during the Permian was diverse and abundant, though it would suffer catastrophically during the end Permian extinction. Coral reefs, though different in composition from modern reefs, flourished in shallow tropical waters. Fish had diversified into numerous forms. Ammonids, relatives of modern nautilus, swam through ancient seas. Trilobites, those iconic arthropods that had dominated Paleozoic seas, were still present but declining in diversity. The formation of Pangea also affected sea levels. The collision of continents reduced the total length of mid-ocean ridges where new oceanic crust forms. This caused sea levels to drop, exposing continental shelves and reducing the area of shallow marine habitat. This marine regression had significant impacts on marine ecosystems, reducing available habitat and potentially contributing to extinctions of shallow-water marine species. As we survey this strange Permian world, we must remember that this configuration of continents, this climate regime, this atmospheric composition, all of these factors created the environmental stage upon which the drama of Permian life unfolded. The creatures that evolved during this time were not random accidents of evolution. They were finely tuned products of their environment, shaped by the unique challenges and opportunities that Pangea presented. The plants that covered the habitable portions of Pangea were also quite different from modern vegetation. The Permian saw the rise of seed plants, including early conifers and seed ferns, groups that would eventually dominate terrestrial ecosystems. These plants had crucial advantages over the spore-bearing plants that had dominated earlier periods. Seeds could survive harsh conditions, waiting for favorable circumstances before germinating. They contained stored nutrition to give the young plant a head start. And they could be dispersed more effectively across the landscape. The forests of the Permian, where they existed, were dominated by various types of seed ferns, early conifers, and cycad-like plants. These weren't the lush rainforests of earlier periods, dominated by tree-sized club mosses and horsetails. Those plants, which required abundant moisture, had largely given way to more drought-tolerant forms. The Permian vegetation had a more open, scrubby character in many regions, adapted to the seasonal availability of water and the generally drier conditions. In the understory and in open areas, a variety of smaller plants eked out an existence. Ferns still persisted in wetter areas. Early forms of herbaceous plants occupied various niches. The overall diversity of plant life was substantial, though perhaps not as spectacular as the coal swamp forests of the Carboniferous or the flowering plant-dominated ecosystems that would emerge much later. This vegetation formed the foundation of terrestrial food webs. Herbivorous animals fed on these plants, converting plant matter into animal biomass. Predators, in turn, fed on the herbivores. Decomposers broke down dead organic matter, recycling nutrients back into the soil. The basic structure of terrestrial ecosystems had been established, though the specific players were very different from what we see today. Into this world of extremes, of seasonal monsoons and vast deserts, of towering mountains and long coastlines, came the Synapsids, the remarkable group of animals that would dominate the Permian period and ultimately give rise to all mammals. These weren't dinosaurs. They weren't even closely related to dinosaurs. They were something entirely different, an evolutionary experiment in terrestrial vertebrate life that would prove remarkably successful, at least until the catastrophe at the end of the Permian. To understand synapsids, we need to step back and consider the broader picture of vertebrate evolution. The first vertebrates were fish, aquatic animals that evolved in the oceans of the early Paleozoic era. From certain lineages of lobe-finned fish evolved the first tetrapods, four-legged vertebrates that ventured onto land during the Devonian period, approximately 375 million years ago. These early tetrapods were tentative land-dwellers at best. They retained many aquatic features and likely spent much of their time in or near water. But over time, various lineages of tetrapods became increasingly well adapted to terrestrial life. They developed more efficient lungs for breathing air. Their skeletons became stronger to support their body weight against gravity. Their skin became more resistant to drying out. And crucially, they evolved the amniotic egg, a self-contained reproductive package that could be laid on land, freeing them from the need to return to water to breed. The evolution of the amniotic egg was a watershed moment in vertebrate evolution. It allowed tetrapods to colonize environments far from water and opened up vast new ecological opportunities. The amniotes, as the descendants of the first egg-laying tetrapods are called, quickly diversified into multiple lineages. Early in this diversification, a major split occurred. One lineage led to the sauropsids, which would eventually give rise to modern reptiles and birds. The other lineage led to the synapsids, the group that would dominate the Permian and ultimately give rise to mammals. These two lineages can be distinguished by features of their skull structure, particularly the number and position of openings in the skull behind the eye socket. Sauropsids are diapsids, meaning they have two such openings on each side of the skull. Synapsids have one opening on each side, positioned low on the skull. This might seem like an arcane anatomical detail, but these skull openings are actually quite significant. They provide space for jaw muscles to bulge when contracted, allowing for more powerful bites. The different configurations in sauropsids and synapsids represent different solutions to the problem of generating strong bite forces. The earliest synapsids appeared in the fossil record during the late Carboniferous period, around 320 million years ago. These early forms, called pelycosaurs, were relatively small and lizard-like in appearance, though they were not actually closely related to lizards. As the Permian period progressed, pelycosaurs diversified into a variety of forms, some small and agile, others growing to impressive sizes. One of the most famous pelycosaurs, and indeed one of the most recognizable animals from the Permian, is Dimetrodon. Despite being featured in countless books and documentaries about dinosaurs, often alongside Tyrannosaurus and Triceratops, Dimetrodon was not a dinosaur. It wasn't even a reptile in the modern sense. It was a synapsid, more closely related to you and me than to any dinosaur. Dimetrodon was a formidable predator during the early Permian, approximately 295 to 272 million years ago. Various species of Dimetrodon have been discovered, ranging in length from around 6 feet to over 15 feet. But Dimetrodon's most distinctive feature wasn't its size, it was the massive sail-like structure on its back. This sail was formed by elongated neural spines extending upward from the vertebrae. These spines supported a membrane of skin, creating a structure that could have served several possible functions. For many years, the dominant hypothesis was that the sail was a thermoregulatory device. The idea was that Dimetrodon, like modern reptiles, was ectothermic, relying on external heat sources to regulate body temperature. By positioning its sail perpendicular to the sun's rays in the morning, Dimetrodon could warm up more quickly, giving it an advantage over prey animals that were still cold and sluggish. This hypothesis has intuitive appeal and is still widely repeated. However, more recent research has cast doubt on the thermoregulatory function of Dimetrodon's sail. Biomechanical analyses suggest that the sail would not have been particularly effective for either heating or cooling. The surface area, while substantial, may not have provided enough advantage to justify the considerable costs of building and maintaining such a structure. Moreover, the blood vessels preserved in some fossil sail spines don't show the pattern expected for a structure primarily involved in heat exchange. An alternative hypothesis that has gained support in recent years is that the sails served primarily as a visual display structure. In this interpretation, the sail would have been brightly colored or patterned, used to signal to potential mates or rivals. Sexual selection could have driven the evolution of increasingly elaborate sails, similar to how sexual selection has produced elaborate ornaments in many modern animals, from peacock tails to deer antlers. The display hypothesis is supported by several observations. First, there is considerable variation in sail size among Dimetrodon fossils, with some individuals having much larger sails than others. This variation could represent sexual dimorphism, with one sex having more elaborate sails. Second, the sail would have been highly visible, making it an effective signal. Third, the metabolic costs of building such a structure, while substantial, are exactly the kind of costly signal that makes a display honest and reliable. Of course, the sail might have served multiple functions. Even if its primary purpose was display, it could have had secondary thermoregulatory effects. Or it might have been used in threat displays, making Dimetrodon appear larger and more intimidating to potential predators or competitors. The fossil record can only tell us so much. We may never know with absolute certainty what Dimetrodon did with its sail. What we do know is that Dimetrodon was a successful predator. Its skull was powerfully built, with large temporal openings that allowed for strong jaw muscles. Its teeth were differentiated, with large canines for piercing and smaller teeth for gripping and cutting. This dental differentiation is actually quite significant. It's a characteristic feature of synapsids that would eventually lead to the highly specialized dentition of mammals. Dimetrodon's limbs projected somewhat to the sides of its body, giving it a sprawling gait similar to modern lizards. This posture was less energy efficient than the upright stance that would later evolve in dinosaurs and mammals, but it was adequate for Dimetrodon's lifestyle as an ambush predator. It likely lurked in vegetation or near water, waiting for prey to come within range before launching a sudden attack. The diet of Dimetrodon probably included a variety of smaller tetrapods, including amphibians and other synapsids. Bite marks found on fossils of potential prey animals match the spacing and size of Dimetrodon teeth, providing direct evidence of its predatory behavior. As the top predator in its ecosystem during the early Permian, Dimetrodon would have played a crucial role in regulating prey populations and shaping community structure. But Dimetrodon was just one of many pelycosaurs that inhabited the early Permian. There were smaller predatory pelycosaurs like Varanosaurus, which resembled Dimetrodon but lacked the sail. There were herbivorous pelycosaurs like Edaphosaurus, which had its own sail structure, though with different proportions and structure than Dimetrodon's sail, suggesting independent evolution or different functions. And there were numerous other forms, filling various ecological niches in early Permian ecosystems. As the Permian period progressed, the pelycosaurs began to decline, giving way to a new group of more advanced synapsids called therapsids. The therapsids represented a major evolutionary advancement. They had more upright limb postures, placing their legs more directly under their bodies. This allowed for more efficient locomotion and potentially higher activity levels. Their skulls showed modifications that allowed for stronger, more precise bites. And crucially, many therapsids showed evidence of more sophisticated metabolism and possibly the beginnings of endothermy, the ability to generate body heat internally. The transition from pelycosaur-grade synapsids to therapsids represented a fundamental shift in how these animals interacted with their environment. No longer were they sluggish, sun-dependent creatures limited by external temperature. Therapsids were beginning to develop the physiological sophistication that would eventually culminate in true mammals. The therapsids diversified rapidly during the Middle and Late Permian, producing an astonishing variety of forms. Some remained small and insectivorous. Others became large herbivores. Still others evolved into fearsome predators. In each case, these animals were exploring new ecological possibilities, testing different adaptations, and ultimately pushing the boundaries of what vertebrate life on land could achieve. One of the most successful groups of herbivorous therapsids was the Dicynodonts. The name Dicynodon means two dog teeth, referring to the pair of tusks that many species possessed. But perhaps more distinctive than the tusks was the beak. Dicynodonts had lost most of their teeth, retaining only the tusks, and had evolved a horny beak similar to that of modern turtles or birds. This beak was used to crop vegetation, which was then processed by powerful jaw muscles. The Dicynodonts were extraordinarily successful and diverse. More than 70 genera of Dicynodonts have been described, ranging from small animals the size of rats to massive beasts rivaling modern rhinos in size. They occupied a wide range of ecological niches and lived on virtually every continent that had formed part of Pangea. Their fossils are among the most commonly found Permian vertebrates, suggesting they were abundant animals in their time. One of the most remarkable Dicynodonts was Lisowicia, a late Permian form from what is now Poland. Lisowicia was enormous, estimated to have weighed around 9 tons and measured over 15 feet in length. This makes it comparable in size to a modern elephant and far larger than any other known Permian terrestrial animal. The discovery of Lisowicia was surprising because it was previously thought that only dinosaurs and mammals evolved such large body sizes in terrestrial environments. Lisowicia demonstrated that therapsids too could achieve gigantic proportions, given the right evolutionary circumstances. The evolution of large body size in Dicynodonts like Lisowicia required numerous adaptations. The skeleton had to be robust enough to support the enormous mass. The limbs needed to be pillar-like, positioned directly under the body. The metabolic rate had to be sufficient to fuel the energy demands of such a large animal. And the digestive system had to be capable of processing enormous quantities of plant material to extract sufficient nutrition. The success of Dicynodonts as herbivores was partly due to their specialized feeding apparatus. The beak allowed them to crop vegetation efficiently. The tusks may have been used for digging up roots or stripping bark from trees. The jaw muscles, which attached to elaborate bony structures on the skull, were powerful enough to process tough plant material. And at least some dicynodonts may have had a gizzard-like structure in their digestive system, using swallowed stones to help grind up plant matter, similar to modern birds. But the Permian wasn't entirely dominated by herbivores and their predators. There were numerous other therapsid lineages, each with their own specializations. The Biomarsuchians were relatively primitive therapsids that retained many pelycosaur-like features. The Dinocephalians were a bizarre group that included both herbivores and carnivores, many with thick skulls that may have been used in headbutting combat. The Anomodonts included not just the dicynodonts but also other specialized herbivorous forms. And then there were the Gorgonopsians, perhaps the most fearsome predators the Permian world had ever seen. The Gorgonopsians were named after the Gorgons of Greek mythology, and the comparison is apparent. These were nightmare predators, combining size, power, and weaponry in a package designed for killing. Gorgonopsians ranged in size from dog-sized to animals approaching the size of modern big cats or even larger. They had powerful, muscular bodies supported by increasingly upright limb postures. Their skulls were heavily built, with large temporal openings for massive jaw muscles. But their most distinctive and terrifying feature was their teeth, particularly their enormous canine teeth. These canines were true sabers, elongated and blade-like, designed to deliver deep, devastating bites. In some species, the canines extended well below the jaw line when the mouth was closed, requiring special flanges on the lower jaw to protect them. These were precision killing instruments, used to dispatch prey quickly and efficiently. One of the largest and most formidable Gorgonopsians was Inostrancevia, which lived in what is now Russia during the late Permian. Inostrancevia was a massive predator, measuring around 11 feet in length and weighing perhaps 500 pounds or more. Its canine teeth were 6 inches long, designed to pierce through the thick skin and into the vital organs of prey animals. Hunting strategies of Inostrancevia and other Gorgonopsians probably involved a combination of stalking and ambush. These animals were not built for sustained high-speed chases. Their sprawling limb posture, while more upright than in pelycosaurs, was still not as efficient as the fully upright stance of later dinosaurs or mammals. Instead, they likely relied on stealth, approaching prey cautiously before launching a sudden, devastating attack. The bite of a Gorgonopsian like Inostrancevia would have been catastrophic to its prey. The long canines would pierce deep into the body, possibly severing major blood vessels or damaging vital organs. The other teeth, including additional smaller canines and incisors, would grip the prey, preventing escape. The powerful jaw muscles would clamp down with tremendous force. Death would likely come quickly, from blood loss, shock, or suffocation if the predator's jaws closed around the prey's throat. The prey animals of Inostrancevia and other Gorgonopsians would have included the numerous herbivorous therapsids that shared their environment, particularly dicynodonts. The relationship between predator and prey drove an evolutionary arms race. As prey animals evolved larger size, thicker skin, defensive horns or spikes, or social behaviors to detect and mob predators, the predators in turn evolved more powerful jaws, larger teeth, greater size, or more sophisticated hunting strategies. This predator-prey dynamic is a fundamental driver of evolution. It creates selection pressure on both sides, constantly pushing both predators and prey toward greater efficiency, whether that means more effective killing or more successful escape. The Gorgonopsians represented the pinnacle of Permian predation, the end result of millions of years of this evolutionary arms race. But Gorgonopsians weren't the only predatory therapsids. The Therocephalians were another diverse group that included both small insect-eaters and medium-sized predators. Some Therocephalians evolved remarkably mammal-like features, including potential evidence for whiskers and even the beginnings of a secondary palate, a structure that allows mammals to breathe while eating. Another important group of predatory therapsids was the cynodonts. The cynodonts would ultimately prove to be the most important therapsid lineage because they would survive the end Permian extinction and eventually give rise to true mammals. But during the Permian, they were relatively modest animals, mostly small to medium-sized predators and insectivores. The cynodonts showed numerous advanced features that pointed toward their mammalian destiny. They had highly differentiated teeth, with incisors, canines, and cheek teeth specialized for different functions. They had a secondary palate, allowing them to breathe while chewing food. They had more upright limb postures and evidence for more efficient locomotion. And crucially, there is evidence that at least some cynodonts were developing endothermy, the ability to maintain a constant body temperature through internal heat generation. Endothermy is one of the defining characteristics of mammals. It requires a high metabolic rate, which in turn requires abundant food and efficient oxygen delivery to tissues. The advantages of endothermy are substantial. An endothermic animal can remain active regardless of external temperature. It can function at night when ectothermic animals are sluggish. It can inhabit cold climates that would be inaccessible to ectotherms. And it can sustain high levels of activity for extended periods. But endothermy also has costs. It requires much more food than ectothermy. A mammal needs roughly 10 times as many calories as a reptile of similar size. It requires insulation to prevent heat loss, which is why mammals have fur and birds have feathers. And it requires sophisticated physiological mechanisms to regulate body temperature, including the ability to shiver to generate heat and to sweat or pant to dissipate excess heat. The evolution of endothermy in synapsids was probably gradual, occurring over millions of years during the Permian and Triassic periods. Various therapsid lineages may have experimented with elevated metabolic rates and improved temperature regulation. The fossil evidence for this transition includes features like turbinal bones in the nasal cavity, which are used to warm and humidify air before it enters the lungs, and changes in bone structure that suggest higher growth rates characteristic of endothermic animals. As we survey the diversity of Permian synapsids, we're struck by the sheer variety of forms and lifestyles. There were tiny insect eaters scurrying through the undergrowth. There were massive herbivores processing tons of vegetation. There were fearsome predators with saber teeth. There were burrowers, climbers, swimmers, and every other conceivable lifestyle that a terrestrial vertebrate might adopt. This diversity reflects the fact that the synapsids had the Permian world largely to themselves. Their main competitors, the sauropsid reptiles, were present but relatively minor players during most of the Permian. The sauropsids would have their day, dominating the Mesozoic era as dinosaurs, pterosaurs, and marine reptiles. But during the Permian, it was the synapsids' world. The ecosystems of Permian Pangea were complex and highly structured. At the base were the primary producers, the plants that captured energy from the sun through photosynthesis. These plants supported populations of herbivorous therapsids, from small dicynodonts to massive forms like Lisowicia. The herbivores, in turn, were hunted by predatory therapsids, from mid-sized therocephalians and cynodonts to the formidable gorgonopsians. But the food web was more complex than this simple linear arrangement suggests. There were also numerous invertebrates, including insects, arachnids, and other arthropods feeding on plants, on detritus, and on each other. There were small vertebrates that specialized in eating these invertebrates. There were scavengers that fed on the remains of dead animals. There were parasites living on and in larger animals. Each species had its niche, its particular way of making a living in the Permian world. The distribution of these animals across Pangea was not uniform. Different regions supported different assemblages of species, depending on local climate, vegetation, and geographical factors. Paleontologists recognize distinct faunal provinces in the Permian, regions characterized by particular sets of species. For example, the Karoo Basin of what is now South Africa has yielded an extraordinary diversity of Permian therapsid fossils, including numerous dicynodonts, gorgonopsians, and other groups. This region was located in the southern part of Pangea during the Permian and apparently supported rich ecosystems with abundant and diverse fauna. In contrast, regions in what is now Russia, which were located in northern Pangea, have yielded different assemblages of species, including distinctive forms like Inostrancevia. The differences between these faunal provinces reflect both geographic isolation and adaptation to different environmental conditions. As the Permian period progressed, changes in climate and environment drove changes in these faunal assemblages. The early Permian fauna, dominated by pelycosaurs like Dimetrodon and early therapsids, gave way to Middle Permian assemblages with different species compositions. And the late Permian saw the rise of some of the most spectacular therapsids, including the largest dicynodonts and the most fearsome gorgonopsians. But overshadowing all of this diversity, all of this evolutionary innovation and ecological complexity, was the approaching catastrophe. As the Permian period drew to a close, changes were occurring that would bring this remarkable world to a devastating end. Volcanic activity was increasing in what is now Siberia. Climate was beginning to shift. Ocean chemistry was changing. The stage was being set for the most severe extinction event in Earth's history. To understand what happened at the end of the Permian, we need to examine the Siberian Traps, one of the largest volcanic events in Earth's history. The term, traps, comes from the Swedish word for stairs, referring to the step-like appearance of the eroded lava flows that now characterize this region. But this seemingly mundane term belies the apocalyptic nature of what occurred. The Siberian Traps eruptions began approximately 252 million years ago, right at the Permian-Triassic boundary. These weren't ordinary volcanic eruptions. They were flood basalt eruptions, where enormous volumes of lava poured out from fissures in the Earth's crust, covering vast areas with layer upon layer of basaltic rock. The scale of the Siberian Traps is difficult to comprehend. Over the course of approximately 1 million years, though with most of the eruptions occurring in a much shorter time span of perhaps 60,000 years or less, these eruptions produced enough lava to cover an area of roughly 3 million square miles to an average depth of around 1 kilometer. The total volume of lava has been estimated at around 1 million cubic miles. To put this in perspective, imagine covering an area roughly equivalent to the continental United States with lava to a depth of over 3,000 feet. The amount of material erupted was staggering, orders of magnitude greater than any volcanic event in recorded human history. The eruption of Mount Tambora in 1815, which caused the year without a summer, and killed tens of thousands of people, released about 36 cubic miles of material. The Siberian Traps released roughly 30,000 times as much. But it wasn't just the lava itself that caused problems. The eruptions also released enormous quantities of volcanic gases into the atmosphere. These gases included sulfur dioxide, which forms sulfuric acid aerosols in the atmosphere, causing short-term cooling and acid rain. They included carbon dioxide, a greenhouse gas that causes long-term warming. They included hydrogen sulfide, a toxic gas. And they included various other compounds that could poison land and sea. The release of carbon dioxide was particularly significant. Estimates suggest that the Siberian Traps eruptions may have released between 13,000 and 43,000 gigatons of carbon dioxide. This massive injection of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere would have caused rapid global warming, potentially raising global temperatures by 8 to 14 degrees Fahrenheit, or even more. The warming would have had numerous cascading effects. Polar ice, if any still existed at the end of the Permian, would have melted, raising sea levels. Ocean circulation patterns would have changed, potentially disrupting the delivery of oxygen to deep ocean waters. Terrestrial rainfall patterns would have shifted. And perhaps most critically, the warming would have affected ocean chemistry. As carbon dioxide dissolves in seawater, it forms carbonic acid, lowering the pH of the ocean. This process, called ocean acidification, makes it difficult for organisms with calcium carbonate shells or skeletons to build and maintain their structures. Many marine organisms, from tiny plankton to larger animals like corals and mollusks, rely on calcium carbonate. If the ocean becomes too acidic, these organisms cannot survive. Evidence from the geological record suggests that ocean acidification was indeed severe during the end Permian extinction. Calcium carbonate sediments show signs of dissolution. Reef-building organisms, which were diverse and abundant during the Permian, virtually disappeared. The extinction rate among marine organisms with calcium carbonate shells was catastrophically high. But ocean acidification and warming weren't the only problems afflicting the oceans. The warming of ocean water would have reduced its capacity to hold dissolved oxygen. At the same time, changes in ocean circulation may have reduced the delivery of oxygen-rich surface water to the deep ocean. The result was widespread ocean anoxia, areas of the ocean with little or no dissolved oxygen. Evidence for ocean anoxia comes from the presence of black shales and rocks from this time period. These shales formed in oxygen-poor conditions and contain high concentrations of organic matter that wasn't decomposed due to the lack of oxygen. The distribution of these black shales suggests that large areas of the ocean floor became anoxic during the end Permian crisis. In some regions, conditions may have deteriorated even further, leading to euxinia, where the deep water not only lacks oxygen but actually contains high concentrations of hydrogen sulfide, a toxic compound. Hydrogen sulfide is lethal to most aerobic organisms and can even escape from the ocean into the atmosphere, potentially poisoning terrestrial life. The combination of high temperatures, ocean acidification, anoxia, and potentially euxinia created what has been called a multi-kill mechanism for marine life. Different organisms were affected by different aspects of the crisis, but virtually no marine ecosystem escaped unscathed. The extinction rate among marine species was approximately 90 to 96%, the highest of any extinction event in Earth's history. On land, the situation was only marginally better. The release of volcanic gases would have caused acid rain, damaging vegetation and poisoning waterways. The climate shifts would have disrupted ecosystems that were already finely balanced to specific temperature and rainfall regimes. The warming would have expanded desert regions and intensified droughts in many areas. There is also evidence for massive wildfires during this period. Charcoal deposits and sediments from the end Permian suggest that vast areas of vegetation burned. These fires would have been triggered by the hot, dry conditions created by global warming and perhaps also by volcanic activity. The fires would have released additional carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, further accelerating warming in a deadly positive feedback loop. For the animals of Permian Pangea, these changes were catastrophic. Herbivores would have struggled as plant communities collapsed due to acid rain, wildfires, and climate change. As herbivores declined, predators would have lost their food source. The carefully balanced ecosystems that had existed for millions of years came apart. The fossil record from the end Permian shows a dramatic decline in both the diversity and abundance of terrestrial vertebrates. Many of the dominant groups of the Permian simply vanished. The Gorgonopsians, those fearsome predators that had ruled Permian ecosystems, went extinct. The large Dicenodonts disappeared. Most lineages of Synapsids either went extinct or were reduced to a few surviving species. The exact kill mechanism for terrestrial vertebrates is still debated. Some researchers emphasize the direct effects of climate change and ecosystem collapse. Others point to potential poisoning by volcanic gases, particularly if hydrogen sulfide from the oceans escaped into the atmosphere. Still others suggest that the collapse of plant communities caused a cascade of extinctions through the food web. Likely, all of these factors played a role, and their effects were synergistic. An animal weakened by food scarcity would be more vulnerable to toxic gases. An ecosystem stressed by climate change would be less resilient to additional disturbances. The end Permian extinction wasn't caused by a single factor but by a perfect storm of environmental catastrophes that struck nearly simultaneously. The recovery from the end Permian extinction was painfully slow. For millions of years after the extinction event, ecosystems remained impoverished, with low diversity and simple food webs. This prolonged recovery period suggests that the environmental disruptions continued long after the initial crisis, or that ecosystems had been so severely damaged that they lacked the resources to rebuild quickly. Some regions show evidence of repeated environmental crises during the early Triassic period, the geological period that followed the Permian. Periodic warming events, ocean anoxia episodes, and other disturbances may have prevented ecosystems from stabilizing and recovering. Each time life began to rebound, another crisis would knock it back down. But life, as resilient as ever, eventually did recover. New species evolved to fill the ecological roles left vacant by the Permian extinctions. On land, several lineages of Synapsids survived and began to diversify again during the Triassic. Among these survivors were the Cynodonts, that remarkable group that would eventually give rise to mammals. The Triassic cynodonts were diverse and successful, at least initially. Some remained small insectivores, while others evolved into larger predators or herbivores. They showed increasingly mammal-like features with each passing million years. Their teeth became more differentiated. Their jaws became more precise and powerful. Their posture became more upright. And crucially, they were probably increasingly endothermic. But the cynodonts wouldn't remain the dominant land animals for long. During the Triassic, a new group was rising to prominence, the archosaurs, the lineage that would give rise to dinosaurs, pterosaurs, and crocodiles. The archosaurs were sauropsids, members of that other great branch of amniotes that had split from the synapsid line hundreds of millions of years earlier. During the Permian, the archosaurs had been minor players, living in the shadow of the dominant therapsids. But they survived the end Permian extinction, and during the Triassic, they began to diversify rapidly. By the late Triassic, dinosaurs had appeared and were beginning to dominate terrestrial ecosystems. The reasons for the shift from therapsid to archosaur dominance are still debated. Some researchers point to superior adaptations in archosaurs, including more upright limb postures and more efficient respiratory systems. Others suggest that environmental changes during the Triassic favored archosaur physiology over therapsid physiology. Still others propose that the end Permian extinction itself, by wiping out many therapsid lineages, opened ecological opportunities that archosaurs were able to exploit. Whatever the reasons, by the end of the Triassic period, the age of therapsid dominance was over. The dinosaurs and other archosaurs ruled the land. The therapsids were reduced to small, nocturnal insectivores, scurrying through the underbrush and avoiding the attention of the giant reptiles that now dominated the world. But these modest, unassuming creatures carried within them the potential for future greatness. During the Mesozoic era, the age of dinosaurs, the descendants of these therapsids evolved into the first true mammals. They remained small and relatively inconspicuous throughout the Mesozoic, but they were developing the characteristics that would define mammals: fur, warm-bloodedness, specialized teeth, enhanced senses, and perhaps most importantly, sophisticated parental care and the development of live birth and milk production. When the dinosaurs were wiped out by the asteroid impact at the end of the Cretaceous period 66 million years ago, the mammals were positioned to diversify and radiate into the ecological niches left vacant. Within a few million years, mammals had evolved into forms ranging from tiny shrews to animals as large as modern bears. Eventually, they would evolve into the astounding diversity we see today, from whales and bats to elephants and primates. And among the primates, approximately 6 to 7 million years ago, emerged the lineage that would lead to humans. We are, in a very real sense, the descendants of those small cynodonts that survived the end Permian extinction. The path from those modest Triassic insectivores to modern humans is long and winding, spanning more than 200 million years. But every step of that journey was shaped by the environments and challenges that our ancestors faced. When we look at the story of Permian Pangea, we're not just examining ancient history. We're exploring our own deep roots, the evolutionary heritage that made us possible. Those strange animals with sails on their backs, those fearsome predators with saber teeth, those hardy survivors that persisted through the worst catastrophe in Earth's history, they are all part of our story. The Permian period teaches us several important lessons. First, it demonstrates the power of evolution to generate diversity. Given sufficient time and opportunity, life will explore an astonishing variety of forms and lifestyles. The therapsids of the Permian were evolution's experiments in terrestrial vertebrate life, and the diversity they achieved was remarkable. Second, the Permian shows us that dominance is temporary. The therapsids ruled the land for many millions of years, but their reign ended. No lineage, no matter how successful, is guaranteed permanent dominance. Environments change, new competitors emerge, and catastrophes strike. Adaptability and resilience are more important for long-term survival than overwhelming dominance at any single point in time. Third, and perhaps most sobering, the end Permian extinction demonstrates the vulnerability of ecosystems to rapid environmental change. The combination of warming, acidification, anoxia, and other factors created a cascade of ecological collapse that even the most successful organisms couldn't survive. The changes were too rapid, too severe, and too widespread. This lesson resonates particularly strongly today, as we face our own period of rapid environmental change driven by human activities. The burning of fossil fuels is increasing atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations at rates comparable to or exceeding those during the Siberian Traps eruptions. Global temperatures are rising. Ocean acidification is occurring. We are, in effect, conducting an experiment on our planet's life support systems. The end Permian extinction shows us what can happen when greenhouse gas emissions spiral out of control. While the modern situation is not identical, the Siberian Traps were erupting for thousands of years, releasing gases at rates we cannot match, and there were other factors at play that are not present today. The basic mechanisms are similar. Rapid warming, ocean acidification, and ecosystem disruption can lead to catastrophic losses of biodiversity. But the Permian also teaches us about resilience. Life survived even the worst catastrophe in Earth's history. It recovered, eventually, and went on to produce new forms of wonder and diversity. The survivors, though reduced in number and humble in appearance, carried forward the legacy of life and ultimately flourished. This resilience is not an excuse for complacency. The recovery from the end Permian extinction took millions of years, and many magnificent organisms were lost forever. The Gorgonopsians, those amazing predators, are gone and will never return. Entire lineages that took millions of years to evolve were wiped out in geological instants. From a human perspective, such losses are essentially permanent. Moreover, while life as a whole has proven resilient, individual species and ecosystems are fragile. The ecosystems we depend on for food, water, climate regulation, and countless other services can collapse if pushed too hard. We have the knowledge and, potentially, the wisdom to avoid repeating the mistakes of the Permian. Whether we have the collective will to do so remains to be seen. As we reflect on the world of Permian Pangea, we should feel a sense of wonder at the strange and magnificent creatures that once walked the earth. Dimetrodon with its spectacular sail, basking in ancient sunlight. Inostrancevia stalking through Permian forests, its saber teeth glinting. Vast herds of Dinosaurs, processing tons of vegetation with their beaked jaws. These were real animals that lived, hunted, fed, mated, and died in a world utterly different from our own. We should also feel a sense of connection to these ancient creatures. The small cynodonts that scurried in their shadows, avoiding predators and eking out a living, were our ancestors. Their survival ensured our existence. The adaptations they evolved, endothermy, specialized teeth, sophisticated senses, are our inheritance. We carry the legacy of the Permian within our very bodies. And we should feel a sense of responsibility. We are the current custodians of this planet, the latest in a long line of dominant species stretching back through time. The mammals that arose after the dinosaurs that ruled the Mesozoic, the Synapsids that dominated the Permian, and all the life that came before, each had their time, and each eventually gave way. Our time will also pass, but what we leave behind, how we treat the ecosystems and species that share this planet with us, that is up to us to decide. The story of Permian Pangea is a reminder that Earth has a deep history, stretching back billions of years before humans appeared. For most of that history, we weren't here. The planet got along without us. But it didn't get along without life, without the complex interplay of evolution and extinction, adaptation and catastrophe, dominance and decline that shapes the biosphere. As we've journeyed through this first part of our exploration of Permian Pangea, we've covered enormous ground, both literally in terms of the geography of the supercontinent, and figuratively in terms of the biological diversity and evolutionary innovations of the period. We've met the pelycosaurs with their sails, the Synapsids with their increasing sophistication, the herbivorous Dinosaurs, and the predatory Gorgonopsians. We've explored the extreme climate of Pangea, the challenges it posed, and how life adapted to meet those challenges. We've also begun to examine the catastrophe that ended this remarkable period, the Siberian Traps eruptions and their devastating effects on global ecosystems. We've seen how the combination of warming, acidification, anoxia, and other environmental changes created a multi-pronged assault on life that few species could survive. In the second part of our journey, we will delve deeper into the extinction event itself, examining the evidence for what happened and why. We'll explore the aftermath and recovery, following the survivors as they rebuild ecosystems and eventually give rise to new dominant groups. We'll trace the evolution of those crucial cynodont survivors as they transform, step by step, into the first true mammals. And we'll reflect on the broader implications of the Permian story for understanding evolution, extinction, and our own place in the grand sweep of Earth's history. The world of Permian Pangea may be separated from us by more than 250 million years, but its lessons remain fresh and its story continues to inspire wonder. These were not crude, primitive creatures stumbling through an underdeveloped world. They were sophisticated, well-adapted organisms that dominated their planet for tens of millions of years. They evolved remarkable innovations, built complex ecosystems, and demonstrated the creative power of evolution. Their world eventually ended in catastrophe, but their legacy lived on in the survivors that would eventually produce all modern mammals, including ourselves. As we continue our exploration, we carry with us the knowledge that we are connected to this ancient world, that the atoms in our bodies may once have been part of a Permian dicynodont or a predatory gorgonopsian, and that the evolutionary heritage they created lives on in us. The journey through deep time continues, and there is much more to discover about this fascinating period in Earth's history. The world of Pangea awaits further exploration, and the lessons it has to teach us are as relevant today as they have ever been. We left our journey standing at the edge of an abyss. Behind us stretched tens of millions of years of astonishing evolutionary invention, a world of sail-backed hunters and beaked giants, of saber-toothed nightmares and humble, whiskered survivors. Ahead of us lay the greatest catastrophe that life on this planet has ever endured. But before we descend into that darkness, before we watch the Permian world burn and choke and drown, we owe these ancient creatures something. We owe them a closer look. We owe them the courtesy of understanding not just how they died, but how they lived. Because the Permian was not merely a prelude to disaster. It was a world in its own right, complete and functioning, with its own seasons and rhythms, its own dawns and dusks, its own quiet mornings and violent afternoons. For 50 million years, life on Pangea went about its business. Animals were born, grew, competed, mated, aged, and died. Forests grew and fell. Rivers changed course. Mountains rose and eroded. The sun rose over the eastern shores of the supercontinent and set over the western deserts, day after day after day, for a span of time so vast that the entire history of our own species would fit inside it hundreds of times over. Let us walk through that world one more time, carefully, before we lose it. Imagine standing on a low ridge in the southern reaches of Pangea, in the region that would one day become the Karoo of South Africa. It is the late Permian, roughly 255 million years ago. The sun is climbing, and the light is harsh and clear, filtered through an atmosphere with slightly less oxygen than the air we breathe today. You would feel it. A brisk walk would leave you breathless in a way it would not at sea level in the modern world. This is an atmosphere that would, at low elevation, feel to a human being roughly like standing on a mountainside. Below the ridge, a broad river winds across a floodplain. The channel is braided and shallow, choked with sandbars, the water carrying a heavy load of silt washed down from highlands to the south. On the banks grow stands of Glossopteris, the signature plant of the southern Permian world, a seed fern with distinctive tongue-shaped leaves arranged in whorls. These are not towering rainforest giants. Most are modest trees, perhaps 20 or 30 feet high, with woody trunks and growth rings that record the seasonal pulse of a climate with genuine winters and genuine summers. The Glossopteris forests of southern Pangea were one of the great botanical empires of Earth's history. Their leaves fell in seasonal drifts, accumulating in swampy hollows and river backwaters, compressing over millions of years into thick seams of coal. Those coal seams would later be found on the southern continents that were once joined together, and their distribution would become one of the first great pieces of evidence that the continents had moved, that Africa and South America and India and Australia and Antarctica had once been a single landmass. A humble fern-like plant, dead for 250 million years, helped humanity understand the architecture of its own planet. Beneath the Glossopteris trees, the ground is not carpeted in grass. There is no grass. Grasses would not evolve for another 180 million years. Instead, the ground cover is a patchwork of low ferns, horsetails clustered near the water, mosses and liverworts in the shaded damp places, and bare soil elsewhere. The soil itself is developing in ways that geologists can read. Ancient soil layers, called paleosols, preserve the chemical signatures of rainfall, of seasonality, of drainage. In the Karoo, these paleosols tell a story of a landscape that was seasonally wet and seasonally parched, with a water table that rose and fell dramatically through the year. Now movement. Along the riverbank, a group of animals is feeding. They are Dinosaurs, perhaps a dozen of them, ranging from full-grown adults the size of large pigs to juveniles no bigger than cats. They are stocky, barrel-chested creatures with short tails and sprawling but powerful limbs. Their heads are the strangest part of them, wide and blunt, with large eye sockets set high, enormous nostril openings, and a jaw structure that seems assembled from spare parts. There are no teeth in the front of the mouth. Instead, there is a horny beak, sharp-edged and constantly renewed, ideal for shearing through fibrous plant stems. In many individuals, a pair of tusks juts down from the upper jaw. Watch how they eat. A Dimetrodon does not chew in the way a cow or a horse chews, with a rotary grinding motion. Its jaw joint permits a sliding, fore and aft motion. The animal grips a mouthful of vegetation with its beak, then draws the lower jaw backward, dragging the plant material between the horny surfaces and slicing it. It is a shearing action, more like a pair of pruning shears than a millstone. It is efficient in its own way, and it worked well enough that Dimetrodons became the most abundant large land animals on Earth for tens of millions of years. The tusks are a puzzle that paleontologists have argued over for generations. Not every Dimetrodon had them. In some species, only some individuals possess them, which suggests sexual dimorphism, tusks in males and not in females, or perhaps tusks growing only in dominant individuals. Where they occur, they show wear patterns. Some are scratched and abraded along the front surface, consistent with digging. Others show wear that suggests they were used to strip bark or to lever up roots. Still others may have served as weapons in disputes over territory or mates, or as display structures signaling maturity and fitness. Recent microscopic studies of Dimetrodon tusks have revealed something remarkable. The internal structure of these tusks records growth in layers, like tree rings. And in those layers, researchers have found evidence of periods of stress, of arrested growth, of times when the animal was not eating well. These stress marks appear in cycles, suggesting seasonal hardship. Here, preserved in the dentine of an animal dead for 250 million years, is a direct record of the monsoon world, of the annual cycle of plenty and privation that shaped life on Pangea. Among the herd, one of the larger animals lifts its head. Something has caught its attention. Dimetrodon eyes were large, set to give a broad field of view, and their nasal passages were substantial, suggesting a good sense of smell. Their hearing was probably less refined than a mammal's, as they lacked the fully developed middle ear apparatus that would evolve later. But they were not deaf. They could detect danger. And danger was abundant. In the shadow of a stand of trees, perhaps 100 yards from the herd, something is watching. It is long-bodied, low-slung, its limbs held more directly beneath its torso than any pelycosaurs ever were. Its skull is deep and narrow, built for strength, with a broad temporal opening on each side where slabs of jaw muscle anchor. Its jaws, when opened, reveal the reason for its reputation. The Gorgonopsians were the apex predators of the late Permian, and they were built around a single, ruthless idea. Their canine teeth were extraordinary, elongated blades of enamel and dentine that in the largest species exceeded 5 or 6 inches in length. These were not the conical piercing teeth of a crocodile. They were laterally compressed, knife-like, with serrated or finely ridged edges in some species, designed not merely to puncture but to cut. The Gorgonopsian jaw could open to an extraordinary gape. Modern predators with saber teeth, such as the extinct saber-toothed cats, needed enormous gape angles to clear their fangs before delivering a bite. Gorgonopsians faced the same geometric problem and solved it the same way, with a jaw articulation and muscle arrangement that permitted the mouth to open wide, perhaps to 90 degrees or more. Watching a Gorgonopsian yawn would have been one of the more alarming sights in the Permian world. But there is something more interesting about Gorgonopsians than their teeth, something that speaks to the deeper story of the Synapsids. Look at their limbs. The forelimbs still splay somewhat to the side, retaining a sprawling posture inherited from more primitive ancestors. But the hind limbs are held much more vertically, the femur angling downward rather than outward, the knee positioned beneath the hip. This is a half-transitional posture, an animal caught in the middle of one of the great biomechanical revolutions in vertebrate history. Why does posture matter so much? Because a sprawling animal must fight its own body weight with every step. The limb bones are loaded in bending and torsion, requiring heavy, robust construction. Worse, a sprawling gait involves side-to-side flexion of the trunk, which in a lung-breathing animal compresses one lung while expanding the other. This is called carrier's constraint, and it means that many sprawling animals literally cannot breathe efficiently while running. They must choose between locomotion and respiration. An upright posture solves both problems. Limb bones are loaded primarily in compression, which bone handles far better. The trunk can remain rigid while the limbs swing in a parasagittal plane, freeing the lungs to work continuously. An upright animal can run and breathe at the same time, which means it can sustain activity for far longer. The Gorgonopsians were partway there. Their hind limbs were doing most of the work, driving the animal forward, while the forelimbs served more as props and steering. It was an intermediate solution, but it was enough to make them formidable pursuit and ambush predators in a world where their prey faced the same constraints. Now imagine the attack. The Gorgonopsian does not charge from a great distance. It closes the gap in a low, fast, committed rush, covering perhaps 40 or 50 yards while the Dimetrodon herd scatters in panic. It targets a subadult, an animal large enough to be worth the effort but not yet strong enough to fight back effectively. The final movement is a lunge, jaws opening wide, the head driving down and forward. The bite lands on the neck or shoulder. The sabers punch through hide and muscle. The predator does not hold on the way a modern big cat clamps a suffocating grip on a throat. Saber teeth are too fragile for prolonged struggle. They can snap if the prey twists violently. Instead, the strategy is likely a slash and release, a devastating wound delivered and then withdrawn, followed by patient pursuit as the prey bleeds out. This is the hypothesis for saber-toothed cats, and it likely applies to Gorgonopsians too. Kill by hemorrhage, not by strangulation. The Dimetrodon staggers away, blood pouring from a wound that has severed major vessels. It travels perhaps a few hundred yards before its legs fail. The Gorgonopsian follows without urgency. There is no need to hurry. The outcome was decided in a fraction of a second, when the sabers went in. This is not gratuitous violence. This is how energy moved through Permian ecosystems. A Gorgonopsian of substantial size needed a great deal of food, and every calorie it consumed had been assembled, leaf by leaf, by herbivores from the photosynthetic products of glossopterous forests. The predator was the apex of a pyramid whose base was sunlight. Remove the base and the apex collapses. That principle would matter enormously when the world began to die. But we should not imagine the Permian as a world consisting only of Dimetrodons and their killers. The landscape was far richer than that, populated by lineages that have no modern analog, and that vanished so completely that we struggle even to picture them. Consider the Pariasaurs. These were not synapsids at all. They belonged to a separate branch of reptile-like animals, the parareptiles, and they represent one of the most peculiar body plans ever assembled. A large Pariasaur could reach 10 feet in length and weigh in the region of 600 kilograms. It was built like a living tank, with a broad, heavy body, stumpy limbs, and a skull covered in bony bosses, knobs, and spikes. Some species had armor plates, called osteoderms, embedded in the skin along the back. Pariasaurs were herbivores, and their teeth were leaf-shaped with serrated edges, ideal for shredding tough vegetation. Their enormous rib cages housed what must have been a vast fermentation chamber, a gut capable of breaking down cellulose with the help of microbial symbionts. They were, in essence, the cows of the Permian, low-slung processing plants converting fibrous plant matter into meat, and they were abundant across Pangea from southern Africa to Russia to China. Their strange armored heads have attracted a great deal of speculation. The bony ornamentation may have been defensive, protecting against the sabers of Gorgonopsians. It may have been for display and species recognition. It may have been used in head-to-head shoving contests between rival males, a behavior seen in many modern horned and antlered mammals. Most likely it was some combination of all three. There is an intriguing footnote to the Pariasaur story. Some researchers have argued that a lineage of small, burrowing pariasaurs may have given rise to turtles, that the distinctive turtle shell might have originated from the osteoderms and expanded ribs of a pariasaur ancestor. This hypothesis remains contested, and molecular evidence has complicated the picture considerably. But the possibility that a fragment of the Permian world still walks among us, carrying its house on its back, is a pleasant thought. Then there were the temnospondyls, the great amphibians of the Paleozoic. These were not frogs or salamanders as we know them, though some are distant relatives of modern amphibians. They were large, flat-headed, wide-mouthed predators that dominated the freshwater ecosystems of Pangea. Some reached lengths of 15 feet or more. Their skulls were broad and shovel-like, sometimes over 3 feet long, with jaws lined with sharp conical teeth and additional teeth on the palate for gripping slippery prey. A temnospondyle hunting strategy would have been familiar to anyone who has watched a modern crocodile. Lie motionless in shallow water, only the eyes and nostrils breaking the surface. Wait for a fish, an amphibian, or an unwary land animal to come within range. Then explode into motion, the enormous mouth snapping shut with a rush of displaced water. Some temnospondyls employed a strange and specialized feeding mechanism. Rather than lifting the lower jaw to close the mouth, they could lift the entire skull upward on a hinge at the back of the head, while the lower jaw remained relatively stationary. This craniokinesis, combined with rapid suction generated by expanding the throat, allowed them to inhale prey items in a fraction of a second. Modern salamanders use a similar suction-feeding strategy, though on a much smaller scale. The temnospondyls were tied to water for reproduction. Their eggs, like those of modern amphibians, lacked the protective membranes of the amniotic egg and had to be laid in water, where they would hatch into aquatic larvae. This dependence made them vulnerable in a world of intensifying aridity, and it would prove nearly fatal when the climate turned catastrophic. But during the Permian, wherever there was permanent water, there were temnospondyls, and they were often the largest predators in their aquatic domain. And then there were the small things. This is where most of the Permian's biodiversity actually lived, and where the fossil record is thinnest because small bones do not survive well. Insects had already been on Earth for well over 100 million years by the Permian, and they had diversified extraordinarily. The giant dragonfly-like griffin flies of the Carboniferous, with wingspans exceeding 2 feet, had declined as atmospheric oxygen levels fell, but insects remained abundant and important. The Permian saw the origin of several major insect groups that survive today, including the ancestors of beetles, of true bugs, of caddisflies and lacewings. Beetles in particular, which would become the most species-rich group of animals on the planet, got their start in the Permian. Insects were doing something ecologically crucial. They were eating plants, and they were being eaten by everything else. The fossil record preserves leaves with chew marks, with mining tunnels between the upper and lower leaf surfaces, with galls formed in response to insect eggs laid in plant tissue. The intricate warfare between plants and insects, which drives so much of modern terrestrial biodiversity, was already well underway. There were also arachnids, including scorpions, spiders, and various extinct groups. There were millipedes and centipedes. There were freshwater crustaceans and mollusks. There were early relatives of modern mites, so small that their fossils can only be found by dissolving rock in acid and examining the residue under a microscope. The Permian soil, teeming with invertebrate life, was a functioning ecosystem in its own right, invisible to us in most fossil deposits, but absolutely essential to the operation of the whole. We should also turn our attention to the sea, because the majority of the Permian's biodiversity, and the overwhelming majority of the Permian's extinction, occurred in the ocean. Panthalassa was the largest ocean in Earth's history, wrapping around a planet whose land was clustered into a single mass. The Tethys Sea, a great wedge of water intruding into the eastern side of Pangea, was warm, shallow in places, and biologically productive. It was here, along the tropical shelves of the Tethys, that Permian marine ecosystems reached their greatest complexity. The reefs of the Permian were built by organisms that no longer exist. Modern reefs are constructed primarily by scleractinian corals, which evolved in the Triassic. Permian reefs were assembled by a different caste entirely. Calcareous sponges, particularly a group called sphinctozoans and inozoans, provided much of the framework. Bryozoans, colonial filter-feeding animals sometimes called moss animals, contributed intricate lattices. Calcareous algae bound the structure together. And rugose and tabulate corals, quite unrelated to modern reef corals, added their own contributions. These reefs were extraordinary structures. The Capitan Reef Complex, whose fossilized remains are exposed in ancient rock formations, was a barrier reef system that stretched for hundreds of miles along the margin of a Permian sea. It rose hundreds of feet above the basin floor. It hosted an entire ecosystem of specialized organisms, from filter feeders to grazers to predators, packed into an environment as crowded and competitive as any modern coral reef. Living on and around these reefs were the brachiopods, which deserve special attention because they were the dominant shelled animals of the Paleozoic seas. A brachiopod superficially resembles a clam, with two hinged shells. But the resemblance is deceptive. Clams and other bivalve mollusks have shells that are mirror images of each other, left and right. Brachiopod shells are different from each other, upper and lower, and each shell is symmetrical about its own midline. Inside, instead of the gills and muscular foot of a clam, a brachiopod houses a lophophore, a spiral or loop structure covered in ciliated tentacles that generates a feeding current and filters food particles from the water. Brachiopods were spectacularly diverse in the Permian. There were thousands of species, occupying every conceivable marine habitat from the intertidal zone to deep water. Some were tiny, some were the size of a dinner plate. Some had smooth shells, others were ribbed, spined, or elaborately frilled. One group, the productids, developed extraordinary long spines that anchored them in soft sediment or deterred predators. Another group, the Ricthopheniids, evolved a bizarre conical form that mimicked a solitary coral, cementing themselves to hard substrates and living inside a horn-shaped lower valve with a small lid-like upper valve. Alongside the brachiopods were crinids, the sea lilies, echinoderms related to starfish and sea urchins but anchored to the seafloor by a stalk, with feathery arms held up into the current to catch food. Crinid meadows carpeted parts of the Permian seafloor, swaying in the currents like underwater wheat fields. When they died, their stalks disarticulated into thousands of button-shaped segments, and in some places these segments accumulated so densely that entire limestone beds are composed almost entirely of crinide debris. There were bryozoans building delicate fans and nets. There were mollusks of many kinds, including gastropods, bivalves, and the shelled cephalopods called ammonids and nautilids. Ammonids in particular are precious to geologists because they evolved rapidly and dispersed widely, making them ideal index fossils for dating rock layers. The intricate suture patterns on their shells, where the internal chamber walls meet the outer shell, form beautiful fractal-like designs that allow specialists to identify species with precision. And there were the last trilobites. These iconic arthropods, which had dominated Cambrian and Ordovician seas hundreds of millions of years earlier, had been in slow decline for a very long time. By the Permian, only a single order remained, the Proetida, and even they were reduced to a handful of genera clinging on in specialized habitats. They had survived multiple mass extinctions. They had endured for nearly 300 million years. They would not survive what was coming. Fish were also abundant and diverse. Sharks and their relatives had already evolved into a bewildering variety of forms, including the Eugeniodonts, one of which, Helicoprion, possessed one of the strangest structures in the entire fossil record. Helicoprion had a spiral whorl of teeth, a coiled buzzsaw of serrated blades set in the lower jaw. For over a century, paleontologists argued about where this toothed whorl was positioned. Was it on the snout? On the tail? In the throat? Modern imaging techniques finally settled the question. The whorl sat in the lower jaw, rotating as new teeth grew and old teeth were pushed inward, functioning as a slicing device for soft-bodied prey like cephalopods. Bony fish were diversifying too. The ray-finned fishes, ancestors of the overwhelming majority of modern fish species, were expanding. Lobe-finned fish, the group that had produced the first tetrapods, still swam in Permian waters, though their days of dominance were behind them. Coelacanth, which would famously survive to the present day, were present. Lungfish burrowed into the mud of seasonal pools, encasing themselves in mucus cocoons to survive the dry season, a strategy their descendants still employ. This was the world. Complex, layered, ancient, and to all appearances stable. In the shallow seas, in the river systems, in the seasonal forests, in the sun-blasted interior, life had settled into arrangements that had persisted for millions of years. There was no reason for any of it to end. And yet, the end did not arrive without warning. This is one of the most important and least appreciated aspects of the Permian story. The Great Dying was not a single event that struck out of a clear sky. It was the culmination of a long deterioration, and there had been a rehearsal. Roughly 8 to 10 million years before the end of the Permian, at the close of a subdivision of the period called the Capitanian, the world suffered a serious extinction event of its own. This is sometimes called the End Guadalupian Extinction, or the Capitanian Crisis, and it was severe enough that some researchers argue it deserves to be counted among the major mass extinctions of Earth's history. The Capitanian Crisis hit the oceans hard. The great reef systems collapsed. Brachiopod diversity plunged. The fusulinid foraminifera, single-celled organisms that had grown to remarkable sizes for protists, some reaching several centimeters in length, suffered devastating losses. Ammonoid lineages were pruned severely. On land, the effects were also significant. Several major therapsid groups vanished or were reduced to remnants. The dinocephalians, that bizarre assemblage of thick-skulled herbivores and carnivores that had been so prominent in the Middle Permian, were essentially wiped out. The largest of them, animals like Mos chops with its enormously thickened skull roof and Ankylosaurus with its massive predatory jaws, disappeared from the fossil record. An entire chapter of therapsid evolution simply closed. What caused the Capitanian Crisis? The leading suspect is another episode of massive volcanism, the Siberian Traps in what is now southwestern China. This was a flood basalt province, similar in kind to the Siberian Traps though smaller in scale. The timing of the Siberian eruptions coincides closely with the extinction pulse, and the geochemical fingerprints in sedimentary rocks from the period, including evidence of ocean anoxia and carbon cycle disruption, are consistent with a volcanic trigger. There may also have been a significant sea level fall, reducing the area of shallow marine habitat, and evidence for climate cooling in some regions. As with most mass extinctions, multiple factors probably interacted. The importance of the Capitanian Crisis for our story is twofold. First, it demonstrates that the Permian world was already under stress before the final catastrophe. Ecosystems that had been damaged and were still recovering would have been less resilient when the next blow fell. Second, it establishes a pattern. Large igneous provinces, those enormous outpourings of flood basalt, are associated with mass extinctions again and again through Earth's history. The Siberian Traps and the Capitanian Crisis. The Siberian Traps and the End Permian Extinction. The Central Atlantic Magmatic Province and the End Triassic Extinction. The Deccan Traps and the End Cretaceous Extinction, in combination with an asteroid impact. When the Earth's mantle belches, life suffers. The Permian would suffer more than any other period in the planet's history. 252 million years ago, in what is now northern Siberia, the crust of the Earth began to tear. Deep beneath the surface, a mantle plume, a column of unusually hot rock rising from far down in the Earth's interior, impinged on the base of the lithosphere. The overlying crust domed upward, stretched, thinned, and finally fractured. Through those fractures, magma found its way to the surface. What followed was not a volcanic eruption in the sense that most people imagine. There was no single cone-shaped mountain hurling ash into the sky. Instead, there were fissure eruptions, cracks in the ground that could extend for tens of kilometers, from which lava poured in curtains of fire. There were vast lava lakes. There were repeated pulses, some lasting years or decades, separated by intervals of quiescence. The numbers involved defy intuition. The Siberian Traps covered an area estimated at up to 7 million square kilometers with volcanic material. The total volume erupted may have exceeded 4 million cubic kilometers, though estimates vary widely. In some places, the stacked lava flows accumulated to a thickness of over 3 kilometers, layer upon layer, a geological staircase built of solidified fire. The eruptions were not continuous over the whole duration. Radiometric dating using uranium lead ratios and zircon crystals has allowed researchers to constrain the timing with remarkable precision. The most intense phase, the pulse most closely associated with the extinction, appears to have lasted on the order of tens of thousands of years, possibly less. In geological terms, that is a flash. In ecological terms, it is an eternity of continuous catastrophe. But here is the crucial point, the detail that transforms the Siberian Traps from a large volcanic event into a planet-killing weapon. The lava did not erupt into a geological vacuum. It erupted through the Tunguska Basin, a sedimentary basin filled with kilometers of ancient rock. And those rocks were not inert. They included coal seams, the compressed remains of Carboniferous and Permian forests, representing enormous quantities of stored carbon. They included evaporite deposits, thick beds of salt and gypsum, rich in sulfur and halogens. They included organic-rich shales and petroleum-bearing strata. When magma intruded into these rocks, it did not simply pass through. It cooked them. Sills, horizontal sheets of magma, spread laterally through the sedimentary layers, heating enormous volumes of rock to temperatures that broke down organic compounds and drove off volatiles. Coal was thermally metamorphosed, releasing carbon dioxide, methane, and a cocktail of organic gases. Evaporites released sulfur dioxide and halogen compounds. The heated rock built up pressure until it fractured explosively, forming vertical pipes through which gases blasted to the surface. Geologists have found these structures in Siberia. They are called breccia pipes or phreatomagmatic pipes, and they are essentially fossilized gas explosions, cylindrical zones of shattered rock hundreds of meters across, extending from the intruded sills to the ancient surface. They are the smoking guns of the greatest mass poisoning in Earth's history. The volume of gas released through this mechanism dwarfs what the magma itself would have contributed. Estimates for total carbon dioxide release range from 10,000 to over 40,000 gigatons. For comparison, the entire pre-industrial atmosphere contained roughly 600 gigatons of carbon. The Siberian Traps event may have injected many times the total pre-existing atmospheric carbon inventory into the air and oceans over a geologically brief interval. And carbon dioxide was only one of the poisons. Sulfur dioxide, released in enormous quantities, would have formed sulfate aerosols in the stratosphere. These aerosols reflect sunlight and cause cooling, and they also return to the surface as acid rain. Pulses of eruption may therefore have caused short, sharp cold snaps superimposed on the longer-term warming trend, whiplashing ecosystems between extremes. Halogen compounds, including chlorine and bromine species released from the baked evaporites, are catalytic destroyers of stratospheric ozone. Models suggest that the Siberian Traps event could have caused severe, sustained damage to the ozone layer, allowing dangerous levels of ultraviolet radiation to reach the surface. This last point connects to one of the most haunting pieces of evidence from the end Permian. In rocks spanning the extinction interval, palynologists, scientists who study fossil pollen and spores, have found something disturbing. The spores of certain plants, particularly Lycopsids, show abnormally high rates of malformation. Instead of the neat, regular tetrads that healthy plants produce, there are unseparated clumps, misshapen grains, developmental failures. Similar malformations are observed in modern plants exposed to high levels of ultraviolet B radiation, and also in plants exposed to certain heavy metals. The interpretation is contested, but the implication is chilling. The plants of the late Permian may have been experiencing widespread genetic damage, a landscape of mutants and reproductive failures, as the sky's protective shield was stripped away and toxic metals rained down. There is also evidence for mercury. Mercury is released by volcanic eruptions and disperses globally through the atmosphere before settling into sediments. Rock sequences from the end Permian, in locations scattered across the world, show pronounced mercury spikes precisely at the extinction horizon. This is one of the strongest lines of evidence tying the biological crisis to the volcanic event, because it demonstrates a global atmospheric signal at exactly the right moment. So what did it actually feel like, on the ground, as the world came apart? The honest answer is that no single organism experienced the whole thing, because the crisis unfolded over a span of time that vastly exceeded any individual lifespan. The best current estimates suggest that the main extinction pulse lasted somewhere between a few thousand and about 60,000 years. Some studies argue for an even shorter interval for the marine extinction, perhaps under 30,000 years. To a dicynodont living in the Karoo, or a brachiopod filtering water on a Tethyan reef, nothing dramatic would have happened in a single day. The catastrophe was measured in generations. 100 generations of gradual warming. 200 generations of shrinking habitat. 500 generations of increasingly frequent failures to reproduce successfully. But over that span, the changes were absolute. Consider temperature first. Oxygen isotope measurements from the fossilized teeth of conodonts, small eel-like animals whose tooth-like elements are abundant in marine sediments, allow reconstruction of ancient seawater temperatures. The results are startling. Sea surface temperatures in the tropics, which had been in the range of 22 to 25 degrees Celsius before the crisis, climbed to something in the region of 35 to 40 degrees Celsius in the aftermath. 40 degrees Celsius is 104 degrees Fahrenheit. That is bathwater. That is a temperature at which most marine animals simply cannot function. Enzymes denature. Metabolic demand for oxygen increases at precisely the moment when warm water can hold less dissolved oxygen. The physiological squeeze is inescapable. Evidence suggests that the tropical oceans and possibly the tropical land surface became effectively uninhabitable for a period during the early Triassic. There is a documented tropical dead zone, a latitudinal band from which vertebrate fossils are almost entirely absent for millions of years. Animals that survived did so at higher latitudes, and even their conditions were hostile. Now add the oxygen problem. Warm water holds less dissolved gas. Sluggish ocean circulation, driven by reduced temperature contrast between poles and equator, means less mixing of oxygen-rich surface water into the depths. Increased nutrient runoff from a landscape stripped of vegetation and battered by acid rain fuels algal blooms, whose decay consumes yet more oxygen. The result was widespread ocean anoxia. Black shales, deposited in oxygen-free bottom waters, appear in marine sequences across the world at the extinction horizon. Geochemical proxies, including uranium isotopes, molybdenum concentrations, and iron speciation, all point to a dramatic expansion of oxygen-depleted water masses. In some regions the situation went further. Certain bacteria, when deprived of oxygen, use sulfate as an alternative electron acceptor in their metabolism, producing hydrogen sulfide as a waste product. Hydrogen sulfide is the gas that smells of rotten eggs, and in concentration it is lethal to virtually all animal life. If these sulfide-rich, or euxinic, waters expanded and eventually welled up onto continental shelves, and if hydrogen sulfide escaped into the atmosphere, the effects on coastal and even terrestrial life would have been catastrophic. Evidence for euxinia comes from biomarkers, specifically molecular fossils called isoreneritane, derived from pigments produced by green sulfur bacteria. These organisms require both light and hydrogen sulfide, meaning they can only live where sulfidic water reaches into the photic zone, the sunlit surface layer. Finding their biomarkers in end Permian sediments implies that hydrogen sulfide had risen close enough to the surface to be a factor in the shallow ocean. Then there is acidification. As carbon dioxide dissolves into seawater, it forms carbonic acid. The ocean's chemistry buffers this to a degree, but when the input is fast enough, the buffering capacity is overwhelmed and pH drops. Boron isotope measurements from Permian marine carbonates have been used to reconstruct ancient ocean pH, and the results indicate a significant acidification event coinciding with the extinction. For organisms that build shells or skeletons from calcium carbonate, acidification is a slow strangulation. It becomes harder to precipitate carbonate. Existing structures begin to dissolve. Larval stages, which are especially vulnerable, fail to develop properly. The pattern of extinction in the marine realm supports this. Heavily calcified organisms with poor physiological buffering capacity, such as brachiopods, corals, crinids, and bryozoans, suffered far worse losses than groups with more active physiologies and better acid-base regulation, such as mollusks and arthropods. Put all of this together, and you have what researchers have described as a multi-kill mechanism. Warming, acidification, anoxia, euxinia, ultraviolet damage, heavy metal poisoning, acid rain, wildfire, habitat loss, food web collapse. No single mechanism accounts for the totality of the extinction, but each one weakened the system further, and together they were unanswerable. The numbers, when we finally state them plainly, are almost impossible to absorb. In the oceans, somewhere between 81 and 96% of species disappeared. The uncertainty in that range reflects the difficulty of estimating species-level diversity from an incomplete fossil record, but even the low end of that range describes a scale of loss without parallel. Entire groups vanished forever. The trilobites, after nearly 300 million years, were gone. The eurypterids, the sea scorpions that had once included the largest arthropods ever to live, were gone. The rugose and tabulate corals, which had built reefs for hundreds of millions of years, were gone. The fusulinid foraminifera were gone. The blastids, a group of stalked echinoderms, were gone. Other groups survived only by the narrowest of margins. The crinids, once so abundant they formed entire limestone beds, were reduced to perhaps a single surviving lineage, from which all modern sea lilies and feather stars descend. The ammonids passed through an extraordinarily tight bottleneck, possibly just one or two surviving lineages, and yet from that remnant they would explode into thousands of species during the Mesozoic. The brachiopods survived but never recovered their former dominance. In the modern oceans they persist as a comparatively obscure group, largely confined to marginal habitats, ecological refugees from a world that ended 250 million years ago. On land, roughly 70% of vertebrate genera disappeared. The gorgonopsians, the great predators, were annihilated. Not a single lineage survived. An entire guild of apex hunters, refined over millions of years, was erased. The therocephalians made it through, barely, and persisted into the Triassic before dwindling. The Dicinodonts survived, but with catastrophic losses. Of the dozens of genera that had populated the late Permian, only a handful crossed the boundary. The Pariasaurs were destroyed. The large temnospondyl amphibians suffered heavily, though some lineages survived and would actually flourish in the Triassic. Insects, which are famously resistant to extinction, suffered their only mass extinction in the entire history of the group. Several major orders vanished. For a lineage that has otherwise weathered every other crisis in Earth's history with barely a scratch, this is perhaps the single most telling statistic of all. The Permian was the one event that even the insects could not shrug off. Plants were devastated. The Glossopteris flora that had blanketed southern Pangea collapsed. Forests across the world died back or disappeared entirely. And here we find one of the strangest and most evocative pieces of evidence from the entire extinction. In sedimentary sequences from the boundary interval, palynologists find a sudden, dramatic surge in the abundance of certain microfossils, dominated by a form called Reduviosporinites. The interpretation of these fossils has been debated. Some argue they are fungal spores, others that they are algal remains. But the traditional and most widely discussed interpretation gave rise to the term fungal spike. If fungal, the implication is stark. A worldwide surge in fungi and other decomposers is exactly what you would expect if forests everywhere were dying simultaneously, leaving vast quantities of dead wood to be broken down. The fungal spike on this reading is the signature of the world's forests rotting. And there is a companion signal. In the aftermath of the extinction, in the earliest Triassic, there is what geologists call the coal gap. For roughly 10 million years, no significant coal deposits formed anywhere on Earth. Coal requires peat, and peat requires wetland forests with sustained plant productivity and waterlogged conditions that inhibit decay. For 10 million years, those conditions did not exist anywhere on the planet in sufficient measure to leave a record. 10 million years without forests worth the name. That is longer than the entire history of the genus Homo. Take a moment with that. There is also a reef gap, a comparable interval during which no metazoan reefs of consequence were constructed anywhere in the world's oceans. Microbial mats and stromatolites, structures built by cyanobacteria that had dominated the seafloor billions of years earlier before the evolution of animals, made a comeback in the early Triassic. It was as if the clock had been turned back, as if the ocean had reverted to a Precambrian condition, a world of slime where complex reef ecosystems had once flourished. What does the world look like in the immediate aftermath of the greatest catastrophe in its history? It looks empty. That is the first and most striking impression that the early Triassic fossil record conveys. Not empty of individuals, necessarily, but empty of variety. Ecologists have a term for what happens after a severe disturbance. The species that thrive are called disaster taxa or opportunists. They tend to share certain characteristics. They reproduce rapidly. They tolerate a wide range of conditions. They are generalists rather than specialists. They can exploit disturbed, unstable environments where more particular species cannot establish themselves. In the early Triassic seas, the classic disaster taxon is a small brachiopod called Lingula, a burrowing form with an unmineralized, chitinophosphatic shell that had already existed largely unchanged for hundreds of millions of years and would continue largely unchanged to the present day. Lingula tolerates low oxygen, variable salinity, and unstable sediments. In the aftermath, in some places, Lingula was seemingly everywhere, monotonous beds of a single organism where complex communities had once existed. Another marine disaster taxon was the bivalve Chlorea, a thin-shelled clam that appears in enormous numbers in early Triassic sediments across the world. Chlorea beds are the marine equivalent of a weed lot, dense monocultures of a hardy opportunist occupying ground that better competitors had abandoned in death. On land, the emblematic survivor is Lystrosaurus. Lystrosaurus was a dicynodont, a member of that great herbivorous therapsid family, and in the late Permian it was one species among many, unremarkable in most respects. It was pig-sized or somewhat smaller, with a short, deep skull, a downturned snout, prominent tusks, a horny beak, and a barrel-shaped body carried on sprawling limbs. There was nothing about it that marked it as destined for greatness. Yet, in the earliest Triassic, Lystrosaurus became, by some estimates, 95% of all land vertebrate individuals in the fossil assemblages where it occurs. In parts of the Karoo Basin, you can walk through rock layers and find Lystrosaurus, and more Lystrosaurus, an entire terrestrial ecosystem reduced to a single dominant animal. Why Lystrosaurus? Several hypotheses have been proposed, none of them fully conclusive, but together they sketch a plausible picture. Its skeleton suggests it was a burrower, or at least that it spent significant time in dens. Fossilized burrows attributable to Lystrosaurus, or close relatives, have been found, and the animal's forelimb structure indicates powerful digging capability. A burrow is a refuge from temperature extremes, from ultraviolet radiation, from wildfire, and from predators. In a world of hostile surface conditions, being able to go underground is an enormous advantage. Its respiratory anatomy may also have helped. Lystrosaurus had a relatively large barrel chest and features of the skull suggesting a substantial capacity for air processing. Some researchers have proposed it was better adapted than most contemporaries to low oxygen conditions, which would have been a critical advantage in an atmosphere depleted by ocean anoxia and the oxidation of enormous quantities of organic carbon. Its diet was generalist. As a beaked herbivore capable of processing tough, low-quality plant material, it could survive on the impoverished vegetation of the post-extinction world, on the ferns and horsetails and scrubby survivors that colonized barren ground. And remarkably, there is evidence that Lystrosaurus changed its life history strategy. Studies of bone histology from Lystrosaurus specimens spanning the extinction boundary suggest that post-extinction individuals grew fast and died young. Permian Lystrosaurus relatives lived for perhaps 15 years or more. Triassic Lystrosaurus appear to have had lifespans of only 2 or 3 years, reaching sexual maturity extremely early and reproducing before the environment could kill them. This is a textbook ecological response to unpredictable, high mortality conditions. When the chance of dying in any given year is high regardless of what you do, natural selection favors breeding fast and often rather than investing in growth and longevity. The bones of Lystrosaurus record, in their microscopic structure, the strategy of an animal living in a world where the future could not be counted upon. Alongside Lystrosaurus in the early Triassic were a few other survivors. Small therocephalians, scurrying insectivores and carnivores. Early cynodonts, of which more shortly. Procolophonids, small paw reptiles that would persist through the Triassic. Temnospondyle amphibians, some of which grew large and became the dominant aquatic predators in the absence of competition. And a few archosauromorphs, members of the reptile lineage that was about to inherit the Earth. The ecosystems these animals formed were simple, unstable, and fragile. Food chains were short. Body size distributions were compressed. Ecological specialization was minimal. And the recovery, when it finally came, was maddeningly slow. Why did recovery take so long? The prevailing estimate is that full ecological recovery, meaning the re-establishment of complex, multi-tiered ecosystems with high diversity and specialized niches, required somewhere between 5 and 10 million years, and in some respects considerably longer. This is far slower than the recovery from any other mass extinction. After the end Cretaceous extinction that killed the dinosaurs, ecosystems rebounded within a few 100,000 to a couple of million years. After the end Permian, the world limped for 10 million. Part of the answer is simply that more was destroyed. When you remove 90% of species, you remove not just individual lineages but entire functional groups. There were no reef builders left. There were no large predators. There were no specialized herbivores. Rebuilding an ecosystem is not just a matter of species multiplying. It requires the reconstitution of ecological relationships, and some of those relationships had to be reinvented from scratch by entirely new lineages. But part of the answer is that the environmental crisis did not end at the boundary. It continued. The early Triassic was a period of profound climatic instability. Carbon isotope records from this interval show wild oscillations, indicating that the global carbon cycle remained fundamentally deranged for millions of years. Anoxic events recurred repeatedly. Temperatures remained extraordinarily high, with evidence for a particularly severe warming episode in the Smithian stage of the early Triassic, associated with a further pulse of extinction. The Siberian Traps also did not simply switch off. Volcanic activity continued intermittently into the Triassic, with later phases characterized more by intrusive activity, sills injecting into sediments, than by surface flows. Each new pulse of intrusion into carbon-rich rocks would have released another dose of greenhouse gas into an atmosphere already saturated with it. There may also have been a feedback problem. Normally, the Earth has a thermostat. Elevated carbon dioxide causes warming. Warming intensifies the water cycle. Intensified rainfall accelerates the chemical weathering of silicate rocks, and that weathering consumes carbon dioxide, drawing it back out of the atmosphere over hundreds of thousands of years. It is a slow but reliable stabilizer. In the early Triassic, this thermostat seems to have been sluggish. Some researchers have suggested that the destruction of terrestrial vegetation impaired weathering, because plant roots and soil biota greatly accelerate the breakdown of rock. A world without forests is a world with a broken thermostat. The removal of vegetation may have locked the planet into a hothouse state that it could only slowly escape. There is also the question of soil. When the world's plant cover collapsed, the soil that plants had held in place was stripped away. Sedimentary records from the boundary intervals show a dramatic change in river systems worldwide. Meandering river channels, characteristic of stable, vegetated floodplains, were replaced by braided channels, characteristic of barren landscapes where sediment moves freely and channels shift constantly. The rivers of the earliest Triassic ran through a world that had lost its skin. Rebuilding soil takes time. Soil is not merely eroded rock, it is a living matrix of mineral particles, organic matter, fungi, bacteria, and invertebrates, built over centuries and millennia. Without soil, plants struggle. Without plants, soil does not form. The recovery had to break out of that trap, and it took a very long time. And yet life did come back. The story of the Triassic recovery is, in its way, as remarkable as the story of the extinction. It demonstrates something profound about the nature of life on Earth, that biological systems, given sufficient time and any surviving foothold, will reassemble complexity from ruins. The recovery proceeded in stages. First came the opportunists, the disaster taxa, colonizing empty ground. Then came diversification within the surviving lineages, as populations expanded and adapted to the various niches now standing vacant. Then came ecological innovation, as new body plans and new ways of making a living were invented. In the sea, the mollusks were the great beneficiaries. Bivalves, which had been overshadowed by brachiopods throughout the Paleozoic, now surged into dominance and never relinquished it. The modern oceans, with their clams and mussels and oysters and scallops, are a legacy of the Permian extinction. Gastropods, the snails, similarly expanded. Ammonids, having passed through their extraordinary bottleneck, exploded in diversity with astonishing speed. Within a few million years they had produced hundreds of new species, and they would remain a dominant element of Mesozoic marine ecosystems until their final extinction alongside the dinosaurs. New groups of reef builders eventually emerged. Scleractinian corals, the ancestors of every coral reef in the modern world, appear in the fossil record in the Middle Triassic, roughly 10 to 15 million years after the extinction. They may have descended from soft-bodied anemone-like ancestors that survived the acidification crisis precisely because they were not calcified, and then evolved skeletons again once ocean chemistry stabilized. The great reefs of the modern tropics trace their lineage to survivors of the Great Dying. Perhaps the most dramatic development in the Triassic oceans was the invasion of the sea by land vertebrates. With marine food webs restructured and predatory niches vacant, several lineages of terrestrial reptiles returned to the water. Ichthyosaurs, with their streamlined, dolphin-like bodies, appeared surprisingly early in the Triassic and became formidable open-ocean predators. Nothosaurs and later plesiosaurs took to the shallows and then the open sea. Placodonts evolved crushing dentition for feeding on shellfish. Thalattosaurs pursued their own aquatic specializations. This was a genuinely new ecological development. The Paleozoic oceans had been dominated by fish and invertebrates. The Mesozoic oceans would be patrolled by air-breathing reptilian giants. The extinction had not merely reset the board, it had changed the rules of the game. On land, the transformation was equally profound, and it centered on a single question: who would inherit the world that the Synapsids had lost? For a brief moment in the early Triassic, it looked as though the answer might be the Synapsids themselves. Lystrosaurus dominated, and the surviving Dicynodont, Therocephalian, and Cynodont lineages began to diversify. The Dicynodonts in particular staged a genuine comeback, producing a variety of new forms including the large and successful Cannemyria and its relatives, robust herbivores that spread across the Triassic world. But something was different this time. The Therapsids were no longer alone. The Archosauromorphs, members of the reptile lineage that had been ecologically marginal throughout the Permian, came through the extinction and began to radiate with remarkable speed. Within the Archosaurs specifically, two great branches emerged. One, the Pseudosuchians, led toward modern crocodilians. The other, the Avemetatarsalia, led toward pterosaurs, dinosaurs, and ultimately birds. Through most of the Triassic, it was the crocodile-line archosaurs that appeared to be winning. The Rauisuchians were large, powerful predators with upright limb postures and deep skulls, occupying the apex predator role that Gorgonopsians had once held. The Aetosaur were armored herbivores. The Phytosaurs, superficially crocodile-like with nostrils positioned near the eyes rather than at the snout tip, dominated aquatic environments. If you had visited the Middle Triassic and been asked to predict which lineage would rule the Mesozoic, you would almost certainly have named the crocodile-line archosaurs. Dinosaurs, when they first appeared in the late Triassic, were small, unimpressive, and rare. Why did the archosaurs ultimately outcompete the therapsids on land? This has been one of the most persistent questions in vertebrate paleontology, and several answers have been proposed. One influential idea concerns respiration. Archosaurs possess, or their ancestors evolved, a highly efficient unidirectional lung system in which air flows in one direction through the gas exchange tissue rather than tidally in and out. Birds retain this system today, and evidence suggests crocodilians and monitor lizards have versions of it as well, implying it is ancestral to archosaurs. Unidirectional flow extracts oxygen far more efficiently than the tidal, bellows-like breathing of mammals. In an early Triassic world with depressed atmospheric oxygen levels, a superior respiratory system would have been an enormous advantage. Animals that could function at altitude, or under exertion, in thin air would outcompete those that could not. The archosaurs may have won the Triassic because they could breathe better. Another idea concerns water conservation. Archosaurs excrete nitrogenous waste as uric acid, a nearly insoluble paste that requires very little water to eliminate. Synapsids, then as now, excreted urea, which requires substantially more water. In the arid, hothouse conditions of the Triassic, the ability to conserve water would have been decisive in many environments. A third idea concerns growth and metabolism. Some analyses suggest that archosaurs could achieve large body sizes more rapidly and efficiently than therapsids, giving them advantages in competition for resources and in predator-prey interactions. Whatever the precise combination of causes, the outcome is not in dispute. Through the Triassic, therapsid diversity declined while archosaur diversity climbed. Then, at the end of the Triassic, another mass extinction, associated with yet another flood basalt province as Pangea began to rift apart, removed most of the crocodile-line archosaurs and cleared the way for dinosaurs to assume total dominance. The dinosaurs would hold that dominance for 135 million years. And through all of it, in the undergrowth, in the leaf litter, in the burrows in the darkness, the descendants of the Permian Synapsids persisted. Now we come to the heart of the story, the thread that connects everything we have discussed to the person watching this, and the species to which they belong. The cynodonts. We met them briefly in the Permian, where they were unremarkable. Small, generally under a meter in length, mostly carnivorous or insectivorous, they lived in the shadows of the Gorgonopsians and the great Dicynodonts. Nothing about their Permian existence suggested that they would still be here 250 million years later, in the form of every mammal that has ever lived. But they had something. Not one thing, but an accumulating suite of features, each modest on its own, that together constituted a fundamentally different way of being an animal. Consider first the teeth. Most reptiles have homodont dentition, meaning all their teeth are essentially the same shape, differing only in size. They replace those teeth continuously throughout life, in waves, so that at any given moment some sockets are empty and others hold teeth of varying maturity. This works perfectly well for a predator that seizes prey and swallows it whole or in large chunks. Cynodonts went a different way. Their teeth became heterodont, differentiated into distinct types performing distinct jobs. Incisors at the front for nipping and grasping. Canines for puncturing. And behind them, post-canine teeth with multiple cusps that could occlude precisely against their counterparts in the opposing jaw. This precise occlusion is the crucial innovation. It means the teeth meet in a specific, repeatable way, allowing food to be sheared, punctured, and crushed before swallowing. Mechanical processing of food in the mouth dramatically increases the surface area available for digestive enzymes, which increases the rate and efficiency of nutrient extraction. An animal that chews can extract more energy from the same amount of food, and can extract it faster. But precise occlusion has a cost. If teeth must meet exactly, they cannot be constantly replaced, because a newly erupted tooth would not fit the established pattern. So cynodonts and their descendants reduced tooth replacement, eventually arriving at the mammalian condition of just two sets, the milk teeth and the permanent teeth, with the permanent set expected to last a lifetime. This has a further consequence, one that ties directly to the deepest features of mammalian biology. If an animal's permanent teeth must last a lifetime, the young cannot use them for processing tough food while the jaw is still growing. Something else must nourish the infant during that period. Milk. The evolution of lactation is intimately connected to the evolution of precise dental occlusion. A juvenile that suckles does not need functional teeth. It can delay tooth eruption until the skull has reached near adult proportions, at which point a single permanent set can be grown that will fit properly for the rest of its life. We cannot see milk in the fossil record directly. Mammary glands do not fossilize. But we can see the dental pattern that implies it, and we can trace that pattern back through the cynodont lineage into the Triassic and, in incipient form, into the Permian. Somewhere in that long transition, an animal began secreting nutritious fluid from glands in its skin to feed its young. It may have begun as antimicrobial secretions to protect eggs, gradually enriched with nutrients over evolutionary time. By the time true mammals appeared, it was a fully developed system. Next, consider the secondary palate. In a primitive tetrapod, the internal nostrils open into the front of the mouth. This means that when the mouth is full, breathing is obstructed. For an animal that swallows prey whole, this is a brief inconvenience. For an animal that chews food thoroughly over an extended period, it is intolerable. Cynodonts evolved a bony shelf separating the nasal passage from the oral cavity, extending the airway backward to open at the rear of the throat. This is the secondary palate, and you can feel it with your tongue right now, the hard roof of your mouth. It allows you to breathe while chewing. It allows an infant to suckle while breathing continuously. It is one of the most consequential small bones in your body. Next, consider the jaw. This is perhaps the single most beautifully documented evolutionary transition in the entire fossil record, and it deserves careful attention. In a primitive synapsid, the lower jaw consists of multiple bones. The tooth-bearing bone is the dentary, but behind it lie the angular, surangular, articular, and several others. The jaw joint is formed between the articular bone of the lower jaw and the quadrate bone of the skull. Over the course of the synapsid lineage, from Permian pelycosaurs through therapsids to cynodonts to mammals, the dentary progressively enlarged while the post-dentary bones progressively shrank. The dentary grew a tall coronid process for muscle attachment, then extended backward toward the skull, and eventually made contact with the squamosal bone. At this point, something extraordinary happened. For a period, some advanced cynodonts possessed a double jaw joint. The old articular quadrate joint remained functional, and a new dentary squamosal joint operated alongside it. Fossils exist that preserve exactly this transitional arrangement, animals with two jaw joints working simultaneously. Then the new joint took over completely, and the old one was freed from its mechanical obligations. The articular and quadrate bones, no longer needed for jaw articulation, were reduced in size and migrated into the middle ear, where they became the malleus and incus, two of the three tiny bones that transmit sound vibrations from the eardrum to the inner ear. The bones that once held your ancestors' jaws together now allow you to hear. This transition is documented in the fossil record with such completeness that it stands as one of the most compelling demonstrations of evolutionary change ever assembled. Specimen after specimen, from the Permian through the Triassic and into the Jurassic, shows the incremental steps. There is no gap. There is no missing link. The links are all present, catalogued, and available for inspection in museum collections around the world. The result was a dramatic improvement in hearing sensitivity, particularly at higher frequencies. Combined with an enhanced sense of smell, indicated by the expansion of the olfactory region of the brain and the elaboration of turbinal bones in the nasal cavity, this gave early mammals a sensory profile suited to operating in darkness. Which brings us to the question of when these animals were active, and why. There is a hypothesis called the nocturnal bottleneck, and it explains a great deal about mammalian biology. The proposal is that for the entire duration of the Mesozoic, roughly 160 million years, mammals and their immediate ancestors were confined to nocturnal or crepuscular niches by competition with dinosaurs. During the day, the archosaurs ruled. At night, the small furry things came out. The evidence is substantial. Most modern mammals retain adaptations characteristic of nocturnal animals. Our sense of smell, relative to that of birds and reptiles, is elaborate. Our hearing extends to high frequencies. Many mammals have whiskers, tactile organs of extraordinary sensitivity, and the neural machinery to process whisker input occupies significant brain real estate. Most tellingly, mammalian color vision is impoverished. Most vertebrates, including birds, reptiles, and fish, possess 4 types of color-detecting cone cells in the retina, giving them tetrachromatic vision with sensitivity extending into the ultraviolet. Most mammals have only 2. 2 of the 4 ancestral cone types were lost somewhere in early mammalian evolution, and the most plausible explanation is that they were unnecessary in animals that operated in darkness where color vision is useless. Primates, including humans, later re-evolved a 3rd cone type through gene duplication, restoring partial trichromatic vision, probably in connection with detecting ripe fruit or young leaves against foliage, or possibly for reading social signals and skin coloration. But we did not recover the 4th. We see a diminished spectrum, and the reason lies in 160 million years spent in the dark. Endothermy fits into this picture too. An animal that is active at night faces a problem. Ambient temperatures drop after sunset, and an ectothermic animal becomes sluggish. The ability to generate heat internally, to maintain a stable operating temperature regardless of the environment, unlocks the night. But endothermy is expensive. A modern mammal burns roughly 5 to 10 times as much energy at rest as a reptile of the same size and body temperature. That energy must come from food, which means an endothermic animal must eat far more, which means it must forage more effectively, which favors better senses, better locomotion, and a bigger brain to coordinate it all. It also means the animal must retain the heat it generates, which requires insulation. Fur. We do not know exactly when fur evolved, but the evidence points to a surprisingly early origin. Fossilized coprolites, preserved feces, from the Permian of Russia contain what appear to be hair-like structures, suggesting that some Permian synapsids already had hair, and that something was eating them. Impressions of fur have been found associated with certain Triassic and Jurassic mammalia forms. And the presence of foramina in the snouts of some cynodont fossils, small holes through which nerves and blood vessels would have passed, has been interpreted as evidence for whiskers, which are modified hairs. If some Permian synapsids had fur, the implication is that elevated metabolic rates and the beginnings of endothermy were already in place before the Great Dying, and that the survivors carried that machinery with them into the Triassic. Add to this the evidence from bone microstructure. The bones of mammals grow rapidly and are densely supplied with blood vessels, producing a characteristic fibrolamellar tissue. The bones of typical reptiles grow more slowly, in seasonal increments, producing lamellar zonal tissue with visible growth rings. When paleontologists section therapsid bones and examine them microscopically, they find increasingly mammal-like patterns as they move up through the synapsid lineage. The trajectory toward high growth rates, high metabolic rates, and continuous physiological activity is clearly visible in the tissue itself. Let us pause here and consider what all this means. A cynodont living in the late Triassic, a small animal perhaps the size of a rat, was already carrying most of the equipment that defines mammals. Differentiated teeth with precise occlusion. A secondary palate. A jaw approaching the mammalian condition, with the incipient middle ear. Probably fur. Probably elevated metabolism. Probably milk. Likely whiskers. Enhanced hearing and smell. An upright limb posture with the legs held beneath the body. A diaphragm, probably, allowing efficient ventilation of the lungs. What it did not have was size, or power, or prominence. It was prey. It was food for the archosaurs that ruled its world. Its life was almost certainly short, dangerous, and lived largely at night. And yet every one of those features, forged in obscurity, would eventually prove decisive. When the asteroid struck at the end of the Cretaceous, 66 million years ago, and the sky filled with debris and the sun was blotted out and the forests burned, the animals that survived were disproportionately small, burrowing, generalist, and able to maintain body temperature and activity in cold darkness while feeding on seeds, insects, and detritus. In other words, the animals that survived were the ones that had spent 160 million years learning to live at the margins. The dominance of dinosaurs ended in an afternoon. The persistence of mammals had been rehearsed for over 100 million years. There is a lesson in that, and it is not a comfortable one for anything that considers itself dominant. We should also be honest about how we know all of this, because the story of Permian paleontology is itself remarkable. The two richest windows into the Permian world are separated by thousands of kilometers and were opened in very different circumstances. The first is the Karoo Basin of South Africa. This is a vast sedimentary basin covering a substantial fraction of the country, filled with layer upon layer of river and floodplain deposits spanning tens of millions of years from the Middle Permian into the Jurassic. The Karoo is, without exaggeration, the single most important terrestrial fossil sequence for this interval anywhere on Earth. It preserves a continuous record across the Permian-Triassic boundary, allowing researchers to watch the ecosystem change through the extinction and into the recovery. Fossil collecting in the Karoo began in the 19th century, and the volume of material recovered is staggering. Tens of thousands of specimens sit in museum collections. The sequence is divided into assemblage zones, each characterized by a distinctive set of species, which allows relative dating of any given locality by identifying the fossils it contains. The Karoo has given us the majority of what we know about Gorgonopsians, about Dicenodont diversity, about the Therocephalians and early Cynodonts, and about the terrestrial dimension of the Great Dying. The second great window is in Russia, along the rivers of the Ural-Foreland and the northern Dvina region. Here, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Russian paleontologists excavated extraordinary bone beds, most famously at Sokolki on the northern Dvina River, where the paleontologist Vladimir Amelitsky and his wife Anna recovered a spectacular assemblage including complete skeletons of Inostrancevia and of the Pariasaur scutosaurus. The story of that excavation is worth recounting. Amelitsky had noticed that certain freshwater mollusk fossils found in Russian Permian rocks resembled those known from South Africa and India, suggesting a former connection between these regions long before continental drift was accepted. Pursuing this insight, he began searching Russian riverbanks for vertebrate fossils. In 1899, he found what he was looking for, a lens of sandstone packed with bones, apparently a log jam or flood deposit in which the carcasses of numerous animals had accumulated. Over subsequent seasons, working with limited funds and considerable difficulty, the Amelitskys extracted tons of material and shipped it back for preparation. The genus Inostrancevia was named in honor of the geologist Alexander Inostrantsev. Its skeletons, mounted in museums, remain among the most impressive fossil vertebrates from the Paleozoic anywhere in the world. There are other important windows. In China, sections through the Permian-Triassic boundary, particularly at Meishan in Zhejiang province, provide the global reference standard for the boundary itself. It is at Meishan that the global boundary stratotype section and point for the base of the Triassic is defined, marked by the first appearance of a particular conodont species. The Meishan section has been studied in exhaustive detail, with high-precision radiometric dates, carbon isotope profiles, mercury measurements, and fossil counts that together constitute the most tightly constrained record of the extinction anywhere. There are Permian localities in Germany, in Scotland, in Brazil, in India, in Antarctica. Antarctic Permian fossils are particularly evocative, because they demonstrate that the frozen continent once supported forests and abundant vertebrate life, including Lystrosaurus, whose presence on Antarctica, Africa, and India was itself powerful early evidence for continental drift. And there is the matter of how we date these rocks. The precision now achievable is astonishing. Volcanic ash layers, deposited during eruptions and interbedded with sedimentary rocks, contain crystals of the mineral zircon. Zircon incorporates uranium into its crystal lattice when it forms but excludes lead. Over time, the uranium decays into lead at a known rate. By measuring the ratio of uranium to lead isotopes in individual zircon crystals, using techniques that involve chemical abrasion to remove damaged crystal domains and mass spectrometry of extraordinary sensitivity, researchers can determine the age of eruption to within tens of thousands of years on a timescale of 250 million years. That is a precision of roughly 1 part in 10,000. It is this precision that allows us to say that the Siberian Traps eruptions and the extinction were synchronous, and to constrain the duration of the crisis so tightly. Without it, the story would be far vaguer, and the causal argument far weaker. Chemical analysis contributes as well. Carbon isotope ratios in sedimentary carbonate and organic matter record perturbations to the global carbon cycle. Oxygen isotopes in phosphatic fossils record ancient temperatures. Sulfur isotopes track the oxygen state of the ocean. Boron isotopes track ocean pH. Strontium isotopes track continental weathering rates. Osmium isotopes track volcanic input. Each of these proxies is a separate instrument reading a different dial on the ancient Earth system, and it is the convergence of their independent testimonies that gives us confidence in the reconstruction. The Permian world is gone, but it left behind a detailed logbook, written in the language of isotopes and crystals and mineralized bone, and we have learned to read it. There is one more strand of the story to trace, and it concerns Pangea itself. The supercontinent did not last. Even as the Permian world was ending and the Triassic world was struggling into existence, the tectonic forces that had assembled Pangea were beginning to pull it apart. The mechanism is straightforward in principle. A supercontinent acts as an insulating blanket over the mantle. Continental crust conducts heat poorly compared to oceanic crust, and it lacks the mechanism of hydrothermal circulation that cools oceanic lithosphere. Heat accumulates beneath a supercontinent, building over tens of millions of years, until the accumulated thermal buoyancy causes the mantle to upwell and the overlying crust to dome, stretch, and finally rift. This process, sometimes called the supercontinent cycle, appears to have operated repeatedly through Earth's history. Pangea was not the first supercontinent. Rodinia preceded it, assembling around 1 billion years ago and breaking up around 750 million years ago. Columbia, or Nuna, preceded that. And there may have been earlier ones still. Pangea began to break up in the Triassic, and the process accelerated dramatically at the end of the Triassic with the eruption of the Central Atlantic Magmatic Province, another enormous flood basalt event that accompanied the rifting of the future continents apart, and, unsurprisingly, another mass extinction. Through the Jurassic and Cretaceous, the fragments dispersed. The northern portion, Laurasia, separated from the southern portion, Gondwana. Then Gondwana itself broke apart, with Africa and South America splitting along a rift that became the South Atlantic, and with India detaching and beginning its long northward journey toward the collision with Asia that would raise the Himalayas. Australia and Antarctica separated late, and the opening of the seaway between them permitted the establishment of the circumpolar current that would eventually freeze Antarctica solid. The dispersal of the continents had profound consequences for climate and for life. Multiple ocean basins allowed complex circulation patterns. The extreme continental climates of Pangea's interior gave way to more moderate, maritime-influenced conditions across most of the land. Separated land masses developed distinct biotas, isolated from one another, which is why the mammals of Australia are so different from those of Africa, and why South America developed its own unique fauna during its long isolation. In a real sense, the modern world's biological diversity is a product of Pangea's fragmentation. Isolation breeds divergence, and divergence generates species. A single world continent produces a relatively homogeneous fauna. A world of separated continents produces a world of endemics. And the cycle is not finished. The continents are still moving. Africa is pressing northward into Europe, closing the Mediterranean. Australia is drifting north toward Asia. The Atlantic is widening while the Pacific narrows. Various models predict that in 100 to 300 million years, the continents will reassemble into a new supercontinent. Researchers have given the hypothetical future landmass various names, and have proposed various configurations, but the basic expectation is widely shared. If it happens, that future supercontinent will experience many of the same conditions Pangea did. Vast arid interiors, extreme continentality, intense monsoons along the coastal margins, reduced shallow marine habitat as coastlines shorten. Whatever life exists then will face the same challenges that the Synapsids faced, and will presumably invent its own solutions. There is something both humbling and oddly reassuring about this. The Earth has patterns. It has rhythms operating on timescales that dwarf anything in human experience. The Permian was one turn of a very slow wheel. So what, in the end, is the meaning of Pangea and the Permian? The first meaning is scientific. The end Permian extinction is the closest thing we have to a controlled experiment on the consequences of rapidly injecting enormous quantities of carbon into the atmosphere and oceans. The parallels with the present are imperfect, and we should be careful not to overstate them. The Siberian Traps released far more carbon in total than human civilization could plausibly release, over a period of thousands to tens of thousands of years rather than centuries. The configuration of continents and oceans was different. Ocean chemistry started from a different baseline. Life itself was differently constituted. But the mechanisms are the same mechanisms. Carbon dioxide is carbon dioxide, whether it comes from cooking coal seams with magma or from burning them in furnaces. Its effect on atmospheric heat retention obeys the same physics. Its effect on ocean pH obeys the same chemistry. Warming reduces oxygen solubility now exactly as it did then. Stratification suppresses deep water ventilation now exactly as it did then. The end Permian tells us what the far end of that road looks like. It tells us that ocean acidification preferentially kills calcifiers. It tells us that warming plus deoxygenation is a devastating combination for marine animals. It tells us that terrestrial ecosystems can collapse when their plant foundation fails. It tells us that recovery from severe biotic crisis is measured in millions of years, not decades. And it tells us something about the pattern of survival. The survivors of the Great Dying were not the magnificent ones. They were not the largest, the most specialized, the most impressively adapted to the world as it had been. Gorgonopsians, superbly engineered killing machines, perfectly optimized for the late Permian, went extinct entirely. Lisowicia, an unremarkable generalist, inherited the Earth. Specialization is a bet on stability. It pays extraordinarily well as long as conditions hold. When conditions break, it is fatal. Generalists lose the competition in good times and win the survival lottery in bad ones. Over geological time, the lottery matters more. The second meaning is genealogical. We are here because of what happened at the end of the Permian. Not merely in the trivial sense that everything that happened is part of the causal chain, but in a specific and traceable sense. Had the extinction not occurred, the Synapsids might have continued their dominance. The archosaurs might have remained marginal. Dinosaurs might never have arisen at all, or might have remained small and unremarkable. The Mesozoic would have belonged to the descendants of the Dimetrodons and Gorgonopsians and their kin. And in that world, the specific lineage of small cynodonts that gave rise to mammals would very likely have remained what it was, one small twig among many on a large and flourishing therapsid tree. There would have been no reason for it to evolve the extreme miniaturization, the nocturnal sensory suite, the high metabolic rate, and the reproductive strategy that together define mammals. Those features were forged by marginalization. They were the products of a lineage forced into the corners of the world by more successful competitors. The mammalian condition is, in a very real sense, a refugee's adaptation. Everything distinctive about us traces back to ancestors that could not compete in the open and had to make a living in the dark. The third meaning is philosophical, and it concerns time. 252 million years is a span that human intuition cannot accommodate. We can write the number. We can perform calculations with it. But we cannot feel it. Try this. Recorded human history covers roughly 5,000 years. Anatomically, modern humans have existed for perhaps 300,000 years. The genus Homo goes back around 2.5 million years. The split between our lineage and that of chimpanzees occurred perhaps 7 million years ago. The extinction of the non-avian dinosaurs was 66 million years ago. The end of the Permian is nearly 4 times as distant as the end of the dinosaurs. It is roughly 100 times as distant as the origin of our genus. It is roughly 800 times as distant as the origin of our species. If you compress the time since the end of the Permian into a single calendar year, with the extinction occurring at midnight on the 1st of January, the dinosaurs would go extinct in late September. The first members of our genus would appear on the 30th of December. Anatomically modern humans would show up in the final hours of the 31st of December. Recorded history would occupy the last 10 minutes before midnight. Everything you know, every civilization, every language, every technology, every war, every work of art occupies the last 10 minutes of a year that began with the Siberian Traps. And here is the thing that makes the Permian so affecting, once that scale is properly felt. Those animals were not primitive. They were not crude prototypes fumbling towards something better. They were complete. A Gorgonopsian was as thoroughly adapted to its environment as a lion is to the savanna. A Dimetrodon herd on a Permian floodplain was as much a functioning ecological reality as a herd of wildebeest is today. The Permian was not a rough draft of the world. It was the world, for 50 million years, which is a span of time longer than the entire subsequent history of the primates. And it ended. Not gradually, not gracefully, but in a convulsion of fire and poison and heat that erased the overwhelming majority of everything alive. Let us end where we began, standing on that low ridge in southern Pangea. The sun is setting now. The light is thickening, going gold and then red as it passes through the dust of a dry continent. The glossopteris trees cast long shadows across the floodplain. The river runs low, its braided channels reduced to threads between wide banks of exposed sand, waiting for the monsoon that will come in a few months and turn this quiet valley into a torrent. Below, the Dimetrodon herd is settling for the night, the adults arranging themselves around the younger animals, heads low, breathing slowly. Somewhere in the trees, unseen, something with sabers waits for full dark. In the undergrowth, small things are stirring. A cynodont, no larger than a house cat, emerges from a burrow beneath the roots of a fallen tree. Its whiskers twitch, sampling the air. Its ears, still primitive by mammalian standards but far better than anything a Gorgonopsian possesses, rotate to catch the sounds of insects moving in the leaf litter. Its fur, if it has fur, holds in the heat its body is generating from within, a small furnace of chemistry burning through calories at a rate no reptile could sustain. It has no idea what it is. It has no idea what it will become. It is simply a small animal at dusk, hungry, cautious, alive. In 8 million years or so, on a scale of time this creature cannot conceive, the sky will darken with volcanic haze and the world will begin to burn. Almost everything it can see from where it stands will be gone. The trees. The great herbivores. The predators. The rivers as it knows them. The reefs in the distant sea. The soil beneath its feet. But something like it will survive. Something small enough to hide, generalist enough to eat what remains, warm enough to endure the cold nights and the long dark. And from that something, across 250 million years, will descend every whale and bat and elephant and mouse and human being that will ever live. The sun goes down over Pangea. The stars come out, arranged in constellations no human eye will ever recognize, because the stars themselves have moved in the intervening time. The supercontinent turns slowly in the dark, one land under one sky, hosting a world that is about to be lost and a lineage that is about to inherit everything. That is the story of the world before dinosaurs. Not a story of failure, but of a magnificent civilization of flesh and bone that flourished for 50 million years and then, through no fault of its own, encountered a planet that turned against it. It is worth remembering them. The sail-backed hunters. The beaked giants. The saber-toothed nightmares. The armored tanks. The great amphibians in their sluggish rivers. The reefs and the crinid meadows and the last of the trilobites. They were here. This was their Earth. And for a while, it was enough.